"They're coming for me." She grabbed his arm with both hands, her voice breaking on the last word, her eyes wild with the kind of fear that doesn't perform, it just bleeds. "Please, don't let them take me back." Cole Whitaker looked down at her hands, looked at the dust rising on the road behind her, looked at the riders coming hard under Nathan Caldwell's brand. He had one breath to decide who he was going to be. He made his choice. Get in the wagon. If this story moved you, subscribe to our channel and follow every part to the end. Tell us in the comments, what city are you watching from? I want to see how far this story traveled. Cole Whitaker had a rule about other people's trouble. He didn't take it on, not because he was a cold man, not because he didn't feel things, but because he had learned slowly, painfully, at a cost he still carried in the silence behind his eyes, that getting involved in other people's problems in this part of Wyoming didn't end with gratitude. It ended with graves. It ended with empty land and a name nobody said out loud anymore because saying it reminded them of what they hadn't done. He'd buried enough names. So the rule stood. It wasn't written down anywhere. It wasn't something he explained to people, because explaining it would have invited the very conversations he was trying to avoid. It was simply the way Cole moved through the world at a distance, with his hat pulled low and his wagon wheels turning steady on whatever road would carry him furthest from anyone else's crisis. He was 3 miles outside of Garnet Creek that Tuesday evening, the summer of 1883, when the rule broke. It didn't break dramatically, it didn't break with thunder or a shot fired in the air or some long speech about decency. It broke the way most important things break quietly, without warning, with someone else's fingers wrapped around his forearm, and a voice so stripped of pride that it didn't sound like a voice at all. It sounded like something falling. "They're coming for me." He'd been focused on the road ahead, guiding the team through a stretch where the ruts deepened and the horses liked to argue. He hadn't heard her approaching, hadn't heard anything except the creak of the wagon frame and the distant call of something moving through the scrub brush on the left side of the road. And then her hand, and then her words. Cole pulled back on the reins before he'd consciously decided to. He looked at her. She was young, middle 20s, maybe with dark hair coming loose from whatever arrangement she'd put it in that morning, and a dress that had seen things a dress wasn't supposed to see. Dust on the hem, a tear along the left sleeve. Her right boot had a broken lace she'd knotted twice and was already losing. Her face was the kind of face that had been trying very hard to stay composed for a very long time, and had just now stopped trying. She wasn't crying. That was the first thing he noticed. A crying woman, Cole understood. A crying woman was frightened or hurt or grieving, and those were conditions you could respond to in a straightforward way. But this woman wasn't crying. Her eyes were wide and dry and fixed on him with an intensity that told him she had already done the math on her options, and he was the only number that hadn't come up negative yet. "Please," she said, "don't let them take me back." Cole looked past her, down the road, still half a mile off, but closing with the kind of purpose that didn't require hurry because it had authority on its side for riders. Horses bigger than working horses. Men sitting in their saddles, like men who had never been told no and had stopped believing it was a real word. He recognized the brand on the lead horse, even at that distance. The Double C Nathan Caldwell's brand. Cole had lived in this county long enough to know that brand the way you knew a bad smell instinctively, and with the immediate impulse to move in the opposite direction. Men riding under the Double C weren't ranch hands. They were a message delivered on horseback. And the message was always the same. Whatever you thought was yours isn't anymore. And if you'd like to discuss that, we can arrange a conversation that ends in your cooperation or your disappearance. Cole looked at the woman. He looked at the riders. He looked back at the woman. "Get in the wagon," he said. She didn't hesitate, didn't ask why or thank him or say anything at all. She climbed up with more speed than he expected from someone who looked as worn down as she did, settled herself on the bench beside him, and folded her hands in her lap with a deliberate stillness that told him she'd been practicing stillness for a while now. Practicing looking like she wasn't scared. Cole clicked the horses forward. He didn't speed up. Speeding up was an admission. He held the same pace he'd been holding, the same angle of shoulders, the same loose grip on the reins. He'd learned years ago that the fastest way to look guilty was to look like you were trying not to look guilty. So he drove, steady, unhurried, like a man who had nowhere particular to be and nothing particular to hide. The riders reached him inside of 3 minutes. The lead man pulled his horse sideways across the road without asking permission. Cole drew the team to a stop and looked at him the way you look at bad weather. Noting it, measuring it, not giving it the satisfaction of alarm. The man's name was Tate Greer. Cole knew him from sight if not from acquaintance. Broad face, jaw like a fence post, eyes the color of old dishwater. He wore a badge that the county sheriff had deputized him with 6 months ago, which meant he had the law's name behind him, even if he didn't have its character. "Evening," Greer said. He wasn't looking at Cole. He was looking at the woman beside Cole. "Evening," Cole said. "You pick someone up on the road?" "I did. Woman by the name of Elizabeth Harper?" Cole glanced at her. She didn't flinch. He turned back to Greer. "She give me her name?" Cole said. "Don't recall that she did." Greer's jaw shifted. "She's a fugitive." "Running from lawful custody, that right?" Cole said it flat, not as a question. "What'd she do?" "That's county business. You're asking me to hand someone over." "I figure that makes it my business too." One of the other riders moved his horse forward a step. Greer raised a hand slightly, stopping him. He wasn't a stupid man, Greer. He was a dangerous one, which was different. Stupid men made loud mistakes. Dangerous men made quiet calculations. "Mr. Whitaker," this Greer said, and Cole felt something shift slightly in the air between them when Greer used his name, because it meant this wasn't accidental, meant they'd known he was on this road. Meant someone had been watching. "You've always been a man who minds his own affairs." "I respect that. Nathan Caldwell respects that. Be a shame if that changed tonight." Cole held his gaze for a long moment. Then he said, "She doesn't look like a fugitive to me. She looks like a woman who's frightened. What she looks like isn't the point." "Maybe it should be." Greer looked at him for 3 full seconds. Cole didn't look away. "I'll ask you one more time," Greer said. "Hand her over." "And I'll answer you one more time," Cole said. "No." The air went very still. The kind of still that has weight to it. The kind of still that men who'd been in difficult situations knew how to read. One of the riders in the back shifted his hand toward his hip, and Cole clocked it without moving his eyes from Greer. "You're making a mistake," Greer said. "Probably," Cole agreed. "Seems to be a habit." Greer looked at him for another beat, then at the woman, then back at Cole. He was running his calculation. Cole could almost see it happening behind those flat eyes, the pros and cons of making a scene on an open road in the early evening when there might be other for travelers. The question of whether Cole Whitaker alone was worth the mess tonight when there would be other opportunities. Greer pulled his horse back. "This isn't finished," he said. "No," Cole said. "I don't expect it is." He drove the horses forward, through the gap the riders left, and didn't look back. He heard them turn, heard them hold their position there on the road, watching him go. Felt the backs of his shoulders the way you feel eyes on them. Beside him, the woman let out a breath. It was so controlled, so carefully rationed, that he realized she'd been holding it since Greer had pulled across the road. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Don't thank me yet," Cole said. "We're not anywhere safe." Her name was Elizabeth Harper. She told him that much within the first half mile, because she said she figured he deserved to know who he'd just made an enemy over. She said it without apology and without drama, and he appreciated both. He didn't push her for more. He drove. He let the silence do what silence was good at, giving a person room to decide what they were ready to say. She lasted another quarter mile before she said, "My father is dead." Cole said nothing. 2 weeks ago, heart, the doctor said. "But my father was healthy. He rode every day. He fixed fences in the heat without slowing down. He was 53 years old, and he'd never been sick a day in his life." She stopped. Started again. "I don't believe it was his heart." "What do you believe it was?" Cole asked. She looked at him sideways. Measuring him. "Fear," she said. I believe it was fear. Nathan Caldwell had been after my father's land for 2 years. Offers my father refused. Threats my father tried to ignore. And then one morning my father went to saddle his horse and didn't come back to the house. And I found him in the barn, and the doctor Nathan Caldwell called said it was his heart. She paused. The doctor Nathan Caldwell paid. And the land? Cole said. 3 days after my father was buried, Nathan produced documents. A bill of sale. He claimed my father had agreed to sell the property before he died. The property my father built with his own hands for 20 years. The property my father told me the week before he died that he would never sell. Not for any price. Her voice didn't waver, but it went very quiet. Those documents are forged. I know they're forged. And I can prove it. Cole glanced at her. I have records, she said. My father kept meticulous records. Every offer Nathan made, every refusal, the dates, the amounts. I have letters my father wrote. I have testimony from neighbors who witnessed Nathan's men on our property uninvited. She stopped. I have enough. I had enough. But I couldn't use it here. Every official in this county belongs to Nathan Caldwell in one form or another. The judge received a loan from Nathan's bank 8 months ago and hasn't ruled against him since. The sheriff owes Nathan for the land his deputy station sits on. The county clerk is Nathan's wife's cousin. So you were going to the federal land office, Cole said. She looked at him with the particular expression of someone recalibrating their assessment of a person. Yes. That's why Greer's men were after you. You were close to getting out of the county. 2 miles, she said. I was 2 miles from the county line. She looked at her hands. They must have had someone watching the roads. I tried to cut across on foot, but there were more of them than I expected, and she stopped. I saw your wagon. Cole was quiet for a moment. How far is the federal land office, he said. Cheyenne. 4 days if the roads cooperate. 4 days. Cole turned that over in his mind. 4 days across open country with Nathan Caldwell's men behind them, and the law or what passed for law in Garnet Creek County working against them. 4 days, with evidence that could bring down a man who'd spent years building himself into something that looked like the county itself. You said you can prove the documents are forged, Cole said. Yes. How? My father had a system. Every contract, every bill, every official document he signed, he added a small mark. A personal notation in the margin, near the bottom of the last page. Nothing obvious, just a symbol he'd developed over years. A way of authenticating his own signature without anyone else knowing to look for it. And the forged document doesn't have it, she said. Nathan's men forged the signature. They forged the language. They got the date right, got the amounts close, but they didn't know about the mark. And my father's legitimate records, the ones in my bag right now, all have it. Cole thought about that. That's not nothing. No, Elizabeth said. It's not nothing, but it's also not everything. Nathan will claim the mark is something I invented after the fact. He'll produce witnesses who say, my father never mentioned such a thing. He'll turn it into his word against mine. And in this county, his word has 20 years of money and fear behind it. She lifted her chin slightly. That's why I need to get it in front of federal investigators. People who don't owe Nathan Caldwell anything. They drove without speaking for a while. The road ahead curved through low hills, and Cole knew a stretch beyond the curve where there was a draw with good cover and water. He'd camped there before. They couldn't press on to any town tonight. Greer's men would have the road covered before long, and they couldn't go back. You live alone? Elizabeth asked. Yes, family? A pause. No, she didn't press it. He gave her a point for that. Why are you helping me? She asked instead. It wasn't an accusation. It was a genuine question asked simply, the way someone asks when they genuinely don't know. Cole thought about the truthful answer, thought about whether the truthful answer was the right answer to give to a stranger in a complicated situation. Decided it probably was, because they were past the point where careful was a useful strategy. I knew a family, he said. Name of Brennan. Settled about 30 miles north of here, 12 years ago. Ran a good operation. Decent people. A man named Rollins wanted their water rights. Rollins was half the man Nathan Caldwell is, in terms of power and reach, but the method was the same. Pressure first, then legal maneuvers, then threats. The Brennans couldn't find anyone willing to stand up for them. Too much risk, too little reward. He stopped. Adjusted. I knew about it. Knew what was happening to them. And I told myself it wasn't my fight. Elizabeth waited. They were gone inside of 6 months, Cole said. Family of 7. Just gone. I don't know where they ended up. Maybe somewhere better. But I know they didn't end up where they were supposed to be, on land that was theirs, and I know I made a choice not to get involved, and I have to live with that choice every morning when I wake up. He looked at the road ahead. So when you grabbed my arm, he said, I guess the answer is I've had 12 years of practice at looking the other way, and I'm tired of the practice. Elizabeth looked at him for a moment. That's a more honest answer than I expected, she said. You asked an honest question. She was quiet for a moment. Then, my father used to say that the most dangerous man in any county wasn't the one with the most guns. It was the one who had convinced everyone else that getting involved wasn't worth it. Cole said, Your father sounds like he was a smart man. He was, she said. He also should have been smarter about who he left his daughter alone with at the end. She didn't say it with bitterness, exactly. But there was something sharp underneath it, something that had been hurting for exactly 2 weeks and was no closer to stopping. They made the draw as the light was going out of the sky. Cole pulled the wagon into the cover of the cut, unhitched the horses, and set them on a long picket line with water and feed from the supplies in the wagon bed. Elizabeth helped without being asked, working on the near horse's harness with a competence that told him she'd done barn work before. You can take the wagon bed, Cole said, pulling a bedroll from under the seat. I'll stay close to the horses. I'm not fragile, Elizabeth said. I know that, Cole said. The wagon beds, that's all. She accepted that and climbed into the wagon, settling among the supply crates, with the bag she'd been carrying against her body all evening, the evidence, he presumed, tucked close against her side. Cole settled against the wheel with his rifle across his knees. He wasn't going to sleep much, he knew that. But he'd been through nights where sleep wasn't an option, and he'd come out the other side of them, and he'd come out of this one too. What he hadn't entirely figured out was what they were going to do about the 4 days between now and Cheyenne. Greer would regroup. Nathan Caldwell would be notified tonight, if he hadn't been already. By morning, the roads would be watched more carefully. There would be more men, more eyes, and the story about Elizabeth Harper being a fugitive would be spreading through every town with a telegraph wire. Cole chewed on the problem in the dark. They couldn't take the main road. That was already decided. They'd have to go cross-country in stretches, which would slow them down and add wear to the horses. They'd need to avoid the relay stations where Nathan's money could buy information. They'd need water sources that weren't on the obvious routes. He knew this country, not perfectly, but well enough. He'd spent years riding it, in better times and worse ones. There was a route. It was harder than the main road. Longer by a day, maybe a day and a half, but it stayed away from the towns where Nathan had influence and cut through land that was still open range, not yet consolidated under any one owner's claim. Cole had just decided on it when Elizabeth spoke from the wagon. He's done this before, she said, to other families. Her voice was quiet, but perfectly clear in the stillness. I know, Cole said. The Hendersons, the Morales family. A widow named Sutton who came here with her brother's claim and was gone inside of 3 months. My father had records on all of them. He'd been collecting evidence for 2 years, waiting until he had enough to make a case that couldn't be ignored. A beat. He was almost there. He told you this? He told me everything. He said. She stopped, started again. He said he didn't want me to be left without knowledge. That was how he put it. Elizabeth, I don't want to leave you without knowledge, as if he knew. Her voice caught, just slightly, then steadied. He gave me the location of everything he'd collected the week before he died. I thought he was just being careful. I think now he knew something was wrong. I think he knew they were going to move against him, and he wanted to make sure it wasn't lost even if he was. Cole was quiet for a long moment. The evidence he collected on the other families, Cole said carefully. You have that too? Yes, all of it. All of it that he had, yes, Cole absorbed that. What Elizabeth was carrying wasn't just her father's case. It was a systematic record of a man who had been preying on this county for years, assembled by someone patient enough and careful enough to build it piece by piece. Thomas Harper, apparently, had understood something that most people in his situation didn't, that individual victims were easy to dismiss, but patterns were harder to argue with. Your father was building a case for federal investigators, Cole said. Not just for himself. That was always the plan, Elizabeth said. He knew local channels were compromised. He went straight to what he believed was the only authority Nathan hadn't reached yet. And you're carrying the whole thing? Yes. Cole sat with that. The horses moved quietly on the picket line. Somewhere in the draw, water ran over stones with a sound like conversation. He put you in danger by doing that, Cole said. Not as an accusation. Just as a fact. He didn't know I'd be the one carrying it, Elizabeth said. He thought he'd be carrying it himself. Cole had nothing useful to say to that, so he said nothing. After a while, Elizabeth said, What will Nathan do when he realizes what I have? Cole chose honesty over comfort. Everything he can. Will it be enough to stop us? Cole looked out at the draw, at the dark shapes of the horses, at the sky beginning to show its stars. Not if we're smarter than him, he said, and are we? He thought about Nathan Caldwell, with his money and his men and his 20 years of getting exactly what he wanted, because everyone around him had decided the price of opposition was too high. He thought about a family named Brennan, gone into the distance 12 years ago, while Cole Whitaker had stood at his own fence line and told himself it wasn't his fight. We're going to find out, he said. He woke her before dawn, not because anything had happened, but because the time before first light was the time when Greer's men would be at their most confident, settled into their watch positions, comfortable. The long dark behind them, and the morning beginning to ease the tension in their shoulders. That was when attention drifted. That was when the gaps appeared. Elizabeth was awake when he touched the wagon side. He suspected she hadn't slept much either. We move now, he said quietly. She was down from the wagon in less than a minute, bag in hand, watching him hitch the team with the focused quiet of someone who'd decided to be useful rather than frightened. He told her the plan in short sentences, the cross-country route, the extra time it would cost them, the places he wanted to avoid. She listened without interrupting, asked one question about water sources on the third day, and accepted his answer. They were moving before the sky had made up its mind about color. The first 2 hours were silent, the horses working through country that hadn't seen a wagon recently, the ride rougher than the road, but quiet in the particular way of open land before anyone else is awake in it. Elizabeth sat beside him and looked at the country moving past them and didn't try to fill the silence with talk. Cole found he didn't mind that. When the sky was fully light, she said, Tell me about Nathan Caldwell. How long has he been here? 20 years, give or take, Cole said. Came in with money from somewhere back east, nobody's ever been entirely sure where from. Bought the first ranch for cash, good land, river access. Built from there, he paused. He's not stupid. He never takes anything directly. There's always a document, always a transaction that looks, on its face, like a legitimate business deal. The fraud is in how those transactions come about. The pressure, the manipulation, the things that happen to people who refuse. Things like my father, things like your father, Cole said carefully. Though I want to be honest with you, I can't tell you for certain what happened to your father. I can tell you that the pattern you're against is consistent with what Nathan does. It's enough for me, Elizabeth said. It may not be enough for a federal court. I know. She adjusted the bag on her lap. That's why I have the documents. They crested a low ridge, and Cole pulled the horses up briefly, scanning the country ahead. Nothing moving on the visible roads. No dust rising where it shouldn't be. He clicked the horses forward. How many families has he done this to? Elizabeth asked. Your honest estimate. Cole thought about it. Counting the ones I'm certain about? 8 or 9. Counting the ones I suspect? Could be twice that. He's been at this a long time, and he's been careful. And in all that time, nobody's been able to stop him. Nobody's tried hard enough, Cole said. People tried individually. One family here, one farmer there, going to the local sheriff who was already in Nathan's pocket, and getting exactly nowhere. Nobody put it all together. He glanced at the bag she was holding. Your father put it together, and then he died, Elizabeth said. And then you picked up what he'd built, Cole said. And you ran for the county line. She looked at him. Don't underestimate what that took, he said. Most people, after losing what you just lost, in 2 weeks' time, would have, I don't know, signed whatever they needed to sign to be left alone. Gone to stay with a cousin somewhere. Started over. My father spent 20 years on that land, Elizabeth said. And 2 years building that case. If I'd signed and walked away, I'd have burned both. I know, Cole said. That's the point. She looked at him for a moment with that measuring expression again, the one she'd used when she was deciding how much to trust what he said. Then she turned back to the horizon. Cole, she said, first time she'd used his name. Do you think we'll make it? Cole thought of Greer's flat eyes on the road last night. Thought of 4 days of open country and a man who had 20 years of practice making problems disappear. I think Nathan Caldwell has never had someone carry this much evidence this far before, Cole said. I think he's counting on the same thing working that's always worked. And I think that's a mistake. Why? Because it's never been me, he said simply. It wasn't bravado. He said it the way he said everything, flat stated, without decoration. Like a fact he'd assessed carefully and found to be accurate. Elizabeth looked at him a moment longer. Then she turned back to the horizon, and Cole thought he saw something in her face that hadn't been there before. Not quite peace. Not quite hope. Something more practical than either. Something that looked like a woman who had finally found solid ground and was calculating how far she could walk on it. Cole kept the horses moving. The country stretched out ahead of them, wide and uncertain and demanding, the way country in this part of the world always did, as if the land itself wanted to know what you were made of before it let you cross it. He'd find out what they were made of. 4 days to Cheyenne. And Nathan Caldwell somewhere behind them, putting everything he had into motion. Cole Whitaker had spent 12 years telling himself that other people's trouble wasn't his to carry. He figured it was time to find out whether that had been wisdom or cowardice. The horses moved through the early light, and he drove, and the woman beside him held her father's evidence against her side, like it was the most important thing in the world. Because it was. They'd been moving for 3 hours when Elizabeth said, "He's going to send more than 4 men." Cole didn't answer right away. He was watching a hawk work a thermal above the ridge to the north, the kind of slow, patient circling that meant either nothing at all or something you hadn't seen yet. He'd learned years ago to pay attention to what the birds were doing. They didn't have opinions or loyalties. They just reported what was there. I know, he said. Greer went back last night. Nathan knows by now, she paused. He'll know you helped me. He'll know your name, your wagon, your team. He'll have descriptions on every road into Cheyenne before midday. Probably before sunrise, Cole said. She looked at him. You don't seem worried. Worried doesn't help the horses move faster, he said. She was quiet for a moment, then said, That's either very calm or very foolish. Been called both, Cole said. Depends on who's doing the calling. The horses worked steadily through country that hadn't seen a maintained road in years, dry creek beds that had to be crossed at angles, stretches of broken rock that slowed them to a walk, long patches of open grass that were easier on the team but harder on the nerves because open grass meant visible from a long way off. Cole kept them to the edges where he could, using the rolls in the land to stay below any reasonable sightline. Elizabeth had stopped flinching at the rough stretches sometime in the first hour. She braced herself against the seat and rode the jolts without complaint, and Cole noticed that she'd shifted the bag with the documents so that it was tucked between her body and the wagon's side, protected from impact on 2 sides instead of 1. She was thinking about the evidence, even when she wasn't talking about it. That told him something about how long she'd been carrying this. "Tell me about the other families," Cole said. "The ones your father had records on." Elizabeth shifted slightly on the seat. "Why?" "Because if we get to Cheyenne and present this to federal investigators, they're going to ask us to explain the pattern. Not just your family's situation, the whole pattern. I want to understand it the way you understand it." She considered that for a moment, and he could see her moving through some internal door, the one between grief and purpose that she'd apparently been practicing opening. "The Hendersons were first," she said. "At least they're the first my father could document. 12 years ago, Samuel Henderson had a farm on the East Fork of the Powder River. Good water access, which was what Nathan wanted. Nathan made him an offer. Samuel refused. 6 weeks later, Samuel was arrested on charges of stealing cattle from Nathan's herd. The evidence was she stopped. There was no real evidence. 2 of Nathan's men testified they'd seen Samuel with the cattle. Samuel had no money for a proper attorney. The judge at the time was a man named Crow, who has since retired to a very comfortable situation in Denver that nobody can entirely explain. Samuel Henderson went to prison, Cole said. 2 years, Elizabeth said. By the time he came out, his wife had been forced to sell the farm to pay debts that had accumulated. She sold it to Nathan Caldwell's land company at 30 cents on the dollar. She pressed her lips together. The land company was structured so that Thin's name didn't appear directly. My father spent 4 months tracing it through 3 different corporations before he found the connection. Cole said, "Your father was thorough." "My father was furious," Elizabeth said, and something in her voice shifted not to anger, exactly, but to a kind of fierce precision that anger sometimes becomes when it's had time to work itself into something useful. He knew Samuel Henderson. They'd come out here the same year, bought adjacent parcels, helped each other with fence lines and harvests. He watched it happen to a man he cared about, and he couldn't do anything about it then, so he decided he was going to document everything Nathan did from that point forward, until he had something that couldn't be ignored. And the Morales family? 8 years ago. Rosa and Ernesto Morales. They had land to the south, near the canyon country. Ernesto disappeared one morning, just didn't come home. The county sheriff investigated for exactly 4 days and closed the case as an accident, probable fall from a cliff face during a night ride. Ernesto's horse was found at the canyon rim. She paused. My father noted in his records that Ernesto had refused Nathan's most recent offer the week before his disappearance, and that Nathan's land company acquired the Morales property from Rosa within 60 days of Ernesto's death. The wagon moved through a long stretch of silence after that. Cole had grown up hearing stories like this, individual tragedies that people in the county filed away under bad luck or misfortune or just the hard nature of frontier life. What he hadn't understood until this moment was that someone had been patiently connecting them, building the lines between each point into a shape that told a different story entirely. My father called it a system, Elizabeth said, as if she'd heard his thought. Not individual crimes, a system. Nathan identified what he wanted, assessed who was vulnerable, applied the appropriate pressure, and when pressure wasn't enough, he used the law, or what looked like the law, to finish it. And the widow Sutton, Cole said. Elizabeth's voice changed slightly, something tighter in it, more personal. Margaret Sutton came here 3 years ago with her brother's land claim. Her brother had died before he could settle it, and she inherited his right to the parcel under federal homestead law. She was on her own. No husband, no family nearby. She'd filed the claim properly. Everything was in order. She stopped. Nathan's attorneys challenged the claim on a technicality, some question about the original filing date and whether the brother had fulfilled the residency requirement before his death. It went before Judge Haller, who is the current judge, who has been the current judge since Nathan arranged for the previous judge to retire in a hurry. Haller ruled against her, Cole said. Haller ruled that the claim was invalid and the land reverted to open territory, at which point Nathan's land company filed a new claim the same afternoon and was approved within a week. Elizabeth's voice was perfectly controlled, now the way something is controlled, when the person speaking has said it many times, in their own head. rehearsing the telling until the rage of it got worn down into something they could carry without flinching. Margaret Sutton left the county on the stage 3 months after she arrived. My father tried to help her. He wrote letters on her behalf, tried to find her an attorney, offered money he couldn't spare. Nothing worked, and your father kept all of this. Every document he could obtain or copy, every witness statement he could record. Every date, every amount, every name. 2 years of it. She touched the bag at her side. It's all in here, Cole. Not just my father's case. All of it. And if Nathan Caldwell understands what I'm actually carrying, he's not going to send 4 men. He's going to send everyone he has. Cole heard something shift in the air between them when she said that. Not fear, exactly something more like the recognition of scale. He'd walked into this the night before thinking about one woman running from 4 riders. He was beginning to understand that what he was actually sitting next to was 12 years of one man's systematic theft of this county, assembled with painful care by someone who was now dead, and currently tucked against the ribs of that dead man's daughter on a hard wagon seat in the middle of open country. He adjusted his grip on the reins. Then we don't let him get close enough to understand it, Cole said. They'd been making good time through the morning, better than Cole had expected, given the terrain. The horses were strong and had been well rested, and Elizabeth, whatever else she was, had an instinct for when to stay quiet so as not to distract Cole from the work of navigation. By mid-morning he'd started to let himself calculate the distance in a way that felt almost optimistic. That was when they came over a low rise and found the man sitting on a rock in the middle of the only passable route through the next 2 miles of broken country, holding a rifle across his knees and looking at them with the unhurried patience of someone who had been very well paid to wait. Cole stopped the team. He didn't reach for his own rifle. Reaching for it now would turn a conversation into something else, and he wasn't ready to turn it into something else. The man on the rock was older than Cole had expected. 60, maybe more, white-haired, lean in the way of someone who'd spent a lifetime outdoors doing hard work, with a face that looked like it had strong opinions about things and didn't apologize for them. He wasn't wearing a Caldwell deputy badge. He wasn't wearing much of anything that suggested official authority. He was just a man with a rifle and a rock and what appeared to be all the time in the world. Cole Whitaker, the man said. That's right, Cole said. My name is Roy Pelham. I used to run cattle in this county before Nathan Caldwell decided he wanted my grazing rights. He said it but without particular heat. I've been watching from the ridge since about an hour before dawn. Saw you come cross-country. Saw Greer's boys riding the main roads. He paused. I counted 6 of them. More than last night. Elizabeth made a small sound beside Cole. What do you want? Cole said. To tell you that the route you're planning, and I'm guessing from your heading you're planning to cut through the Dawson Draw and come up behind Hartley's station, is blocked. Nathan had men there before you left your camp this morning. He's not just watching the roads. He's watching the water sources. Cole stared at him. How do you know what route I'm planning? Because it's the route I'd plan, Pelham said. It's the only route that makes sense if you're trying to avoid the main roads and stay off Nathan's telegraph lines. I know this country the same way you do, son. I've been riding it for 40 years. Cole held the man's gaze, old eyes clear and direct, without the particular quality of calculation that men with agendas usually couldn't keep out of their expression. He looked like what he said. He was a rancher who'd been on the losing end of Nathan Caldwell's system and was here, now, on a rock in the middle of nowhere, for reasons Cole hadn't figured out yet. Why are you telling us this? Elizabeth asked. Cole noticed she'd asked it herself rather than waiting for him to ask it, and that Pelham shifted his attention to her with a particular focus when she spoke. Because I know who you are, Miss Harper, Pelham said. I knew your father. Thomas was a good man. He came to me 3 years ago, asked if I'd be willing to put down in writing what happened to my grazing rights. I told him the whole story. Gave him documents. I figured it wouldn't matter. Figured one more piece of paper wasn't going to stop a man like Nathan Caldwell. He stopped. Looked at his boots for a moment. I've been thinking about that decision since I heard Thomas died, he said. Thinking about whether I should have done more. Whether all of us who've been waiting and watching should have done more before it got to this. Elizabeth's voice was careful. And now, Pelham said, I figure waiting's gotten enough people hurt. I know 3 other men who've been sitting on the same question. Men who gave your father statements. Men who have been afraid to push it further because they've got families, because they've got what's left of their properties, because they know what Nathan does to people who step out of line. Cole said, You said the route through Dawson Draw is blocked. Is there another way? Yes, Pelham said. But it's longer. 2 extra days if you push hard. Crosses territory that Nathan doesn't have men watching because he doesn't think anyone would take it. It's rough. Real rough. Not dangerous if you know it, but the kind of rough that a man sends his wagon around rather than through. He looked at Cole steadily. You'd need someone who knows the trail. Cole understood what he was offering. He looked at Pelham for a long moment, the rifle across the old man's knees. The clear eyes. The way he'd said Thomas was a good man not as a pleasantry, but as a fact he'd weighed and found accurate. That's a lot to risk for a man you knew 3 years ago, Cole said. It's a lot to risk for any man, Pelham agreed. But Thomas Harper spent 2 years building something. I helped build part of it. Seems a waste to let it die on a wagon trail because nobody was willing to show the way through. Elizabeth said quietly but clearly, Mr. Pelham, are there really 3 other men? Pelham looked at her. Yes, he said, and they're not far. The wagon moved again within 10 minutes, with Roy Pelham on a rangy gray horse he'd had picketed below the ridge, riding point ahead of them while Cole handled the team. Elizabeth sat beside Cole, her bag on her lap, watching Pelham's straight back ahead of them with an expression Cole couldn't entirely read. You trust him, she said quietly, so only Cole could hear. I trust that he knew your father, Cole said, and I trust that what he said about the route checks out. He could have been wrong, or he could have been leading us somewhere, but everything he told us about Dawson Draw is consistent with what I know about how Nathan moves his men. That's not quite the same as trusting him. No, Cole said. It's not. He kept his eyes on the country ahead. But we're past the point where we can afford to be alone in this. Elizabeth said nothing for a moment. Then he said there are 3 other men. He said they're not far. How many people knew what my father was building? She said. It wasn't exactly a question. It was something she was turning over in her mind, examining from different angles. More than Nathan knows, Cole said. That's my guess. She looked at him. Is that good or bad? Depends on whether any of them are willing to stand up and say what they know, Cole said. Evidence in a bag is one thing. Evidence with living voices attached to it is something else entirely. She was quiet after that, but it was a different kind of quiet than before. Not the quiet of someone holding herself together. The quiet of someone thinking hard. Pelham led them off the visible trail within the hour, into country that justified everything he'd said about it being rough. The wagon took it hard, and Cole worked the team carefully through each bad stretch, talking to the horses in the low, steady murmur that kept them willing in uncertain footing. Elizabeth watched the technique with open attention. Where did you learn that? She asked, during a stretch where the ground evened out enough to allow conversation. My father, Cole said. He was a horseman before anything else. Said if you couldn't make a horse want to do a thing, you weren't going to get very far making it do it, eh? Smart man, he was, Cole said. He also said that the same principle applied to people. Elizabeth smiled. It was small and brief, and it changed her face in a way that surprised Cole, not because it made her look younger, exactly, but because it made her look momentarily less burdened. Like the person she would have been if the last 2 weeks hadn't happened. Your father, she said. Is been gone a long time, Cole said simply. I'm sorry, she said. He'd have liked that you're doing this, Cole said. Not as a comfort, but as a genuine observation. He was a man who thought very poorly of watching injustice happen and keeping your hands in your pockets. He sounds like my father, Elizabeth said. Maybe, Cole said. Maybe that's why I'm here. Pelham pulled his horse up ahead and turned in the saddle, waiting for the wagon to come alongside. When Cole drew level, Pelham nodded toward a thinning in the country to the east. There's a camp about 2 miles that direction. Pelham said. Men I told you about. I sent word yesterday when I first saw you moving. They've been waiting. Cole looked at him steadily. You sent word yesterday. Before you even left your draw, Pelham said without apology. I've been watching Nathan's men move for 3 days. I knew when you took that woman from Greer on the road. I knew where you were camped, and I knew you'd need the help. Didn't see much point in waiting around to see if I was right about that. Cole looked at the old man for a long moment. You've been planning this, Cole said. Hoping, Pelham said. There's a difference. I hoped someone would be foolish enough to actually try. When I saw it was you, I figured the odds improved somewhat. Why me specifically? Pelham looked at him with an expression that was almost amused. Because you haven't lost anything to Nathan yet. Men who've lost things to Nathan are either broken or careful. Men who haven't had their loss yet are the only ones with enough freedom left to make the kind of choice you made last night. Cole turned that over. It was uncomfortably accurate. How many men are at this camp? Elizabeth asked Pelham. 3, Pelham said. Frank and Dora Birch, she'll want to come. I'm telling you in advance, and a man named Chester Avery, who worked as a county clerk 6 years ago until Nathan had him removed on trumped-up incompetency charges. Chester knows where the records are buried. The official ones. The ones that could corroborate what you're carrying. Elizabeth's breath changed. Just slightly. He knows where the county records are. He knows more than where they are, Pelham said. He knows which ones Nathan's people have altered. Knows the originals because he processed them himself before the alterations. He's been carrying that knowledge for 6 years with nowhere to put it. Elizabeth's hand went to her bag, not gripping it, just touching it. The way you touch something to confirm it's still there. The federal investigators would need a witness who can speak to the county records, she said slowly. Someone with direct knowledge of the originals. Someone who processed them officially. Chester Avery can speak to that, Pelham said. Cole watched Elizabeth's face. Watched the thing that had been building into her since the moment she'd climbed into his wagon begin to change shape from desperation into something harder and more purposeful. The evidence in her bag had always been the foundation. But evidence without witnesses was architecture without walls. And witnesses, people willing to stand up in front of federal authority and say what they knew, were what turned a case into a conviction. Her father had collected the documents. But the voices that could prove what the documents meant were still here, scattered and waiting and afraid. Take us there, Cole said to Pelham. The camp in the eastern draw wasn't what Cole had expected. He'd been picturing something makeshift, a few men sitting on rocks, trying to look like they hadn't just made a decision that could end badly for all of them. What he found was more settled than that: a fire with a coffee pot, bedrolls spread with some care, horses well tended on a picket line. The kind of camp people make when they've been waiting long enough to get comfortable. Frank Birch was a square-built man in his 50s, with the hands of someone who'd spent a lifetime with them, and the expression of someone who had made up his mind about a thing and was not entertaining second thoughts about it. His wife Dora Pelham had been right about her coming, stood when the wagon pulled in, and looked at Elizabeth with an assessment that was direct and complete and took about 3 seconds. You're Thomas Harper's girl, Dora said. Yes, Elizabeth said. Good, Dora said, in the tone of someone crossing an item off a list. Sit down. Chester's going to need to talk to you. Chester Avery was smaller than Cole had pictured him. Slight, with quick eyes and the nervous, precise mannerisms of a man who'd spent years handling documents, someone used to careful, specific attention to detail. He shook Elizabeth's hand with both of his, and Cole saw the moment he recognized what she was carrying. He gave it to you, Chester said. He was looking at the bag. He gave me the location, Elizabeth said. I retrieved it before I ran. Chester nodded, a series of small, rapid nods. Smart. Thomas was smart to give it to you. I was afraid it had been lost when I heard he'd died. He stopped, regrouped, started again. Miss Harper, your father contacted me 2 years ago. He was trying to understand the county records, the property transfers, how Nathan's land transactions had been processed. Yet, I told him what I knew. I told him which entries had been altered after the fact, which recording dates had been changed, and which deeds showed evidence of tampering that I'd personally observed before I left the clerk's office. You gave him a statement, Elizabeth said. A full statement. Documented. Signed. Chester hesitated. And then I spent the next 2 years telling myself it was enough that I'd done my part, that if Thomas could get the rest of the evidence together, he wouldn't need me in person. He looked at her steadily. That was me being afraid. I know that now. I'm telling you now because I'm not willing to be afraid anymore. Elizabeth looked at him for a long moment. Something passed between them, not sentiment exactly, but recognition. The recognition of two people who had been doing the right thing in private, who had just met each other in the open, and who were both feeling the strange weight of that. I need you to be willing to testify, Elizabeth said. In person, to federal investigators. Everything you know about those records. I know, Chester said. I'm ready, Dora said. From where she'd been listening by the fire, we're all ready. That's why we're here. Cole stood slightly apart from the group, watching this happen, and felt something shift in the nature of what he'd walked into the night before. He'd thought he was helping one woman make it across 4 days of hostile country. He was beginning to understand that he was standing at the convergence of something that had been building for 12 years, every piece of evidence Thomas Harper had collected, every person who'd given a statement and then gone quiet, every family who'd been pushed off their land and swallowed their grief in silence. All of it was here now. All of it was moving. Frank Birch said, "We can't stay here long." Nathan's got riders out broad. They're covering more ground than I've ever seen him use before, which means he knows. He looked at Elizabeth. He knows what you're carrying is bigger than just your father's case. He may not know the specifics, Cole said, but he knows we got past Greer. He knows she had time to plan before she ran. He'll assume the worst. The worst for him is exactly what she's got, Pelham said. So what's the plan? Dora asked, not impatiently with the brisk practicality of someone who needed to know what to pack. Cole looked at Elizabeth. This was her case, her father's work, her decision. Elizabeth stood straight and said, "We travel together to Cheyenne. All of us who are willing. We don't split up. Splitting up gives Nathan's men individual targets. Together, we're harder to stop quietly, and we're too many to disappear without a noise he can't control." She paused. "And we bring everything. Every document, every statement, every witness. We don't give federal investigators a piece of what we have. We give them all of it." Silence in the camp. Frank Birch looked at his wife. Dora looked at Chester. Chester looked at Roy Pelham. Pelham looked at Cole. Cole said nothing. It wasn't his speech to give. Frank said, "My wife's coming either way. I figured I should go where she does." He said it simply, with a kind of gruff tenderness. Chester said, "I've been carrying what I know for 6 years. I'm done carrying it alone." Pelham said, "I had 40 years in this county before Nathan Caldwell started taking it apart piece by piece. I figure I've got a say in what happens to it." Cole watched Elizabeth absorb that the shift in the air when people who'd been quiet for years all said yes at the same moment. She held herself very still, the way she'd held herself on the wagon bench when Greer had pulled across the road. But this time he thought the stillness had something different in it. Not performance, not composure held together against fear. Something that was finally, after 2 weeks of loss, and running and carrying the weight of her father's unfinished work, beginning to feel like possibility. She looked at Cole. He looked back at her. 2 extra days, she said. With this route, approximately, he said. Cheyenne in 6 days. If we push, then we push, she said. She turned back to the group, and Cole saw in the angle of her shoulders and the lift of her chin the woman she'd been before all this had fallen on her. The woman Thomas Harper had spent 20 years raising to understand the value of land, of records, of careful truth. The woman who had memorized her father's marking system and retrieved his files and run for the county line alone. He thought about what she'd said. Earlier in the morning, her father had wanted her to have knowledge. He was beginning to understand that Thomas Harper had wanted something else as well. He'd wanted her to have the courage to use it. Outside the camp, the country was wide open and hostile and full of Nathan Caldwell's riders working through it, like a net being pulled tight. Inside the camp, 6 people were deciding that the net wasn't going to hold. Cole checked his rifle, counted his ammunition, and began thinking about how to move a group of 6 people and 4 horses across 2 days of rough country without being seen. Nathan Caldwell was used to making problems disappear. He'd never tried to make a problem that had voices before. They moved out of the draw before the fire had cooled. Pelham took point on the gray horse, reading the country ahead with the quiet confidence of a man who'd spent 4 decades learning every fold and feature of it. Cole drove the wagon. Frank and Dora Birch rode together on a sturdy bay that had seen better years but still had work in it. Chester Avery, who admitted freely that he was not a natural horseman, sat in the wagon bed behind Cole and Elizabeth, holding the side rail with both hands and not complaining about it. They traveled in silence for the first hour. Not the silence of people who had nothing to say, but the silence of people who understood that the country around them was listening, and that voices carried in ways that weren't always predictable. Elizabeth had the bag on her lap. She'd been holding it that way for so long now that Cole suspected she wasn't entirely conscious of it anymore. It had become part of how she held herself, part of the architecture of the last 2 weeks. He thought about Thomas Harper, a man he'd never met, who'd spent 2 years building a case that his daughter was now carrying through hostile country on her lap. He thought about the discipline that required, the faith it required, the particular kind of love a man must have for truth and for the child he was going to leave behind, to spend 2 years doing something that quietly, that carefully, that completely. Chester said from the wagon bed, not loudly, he talked about her, you know. Thomas. When I met with him, he talked about Elizabeth. Cole didn't respond. He let Chester continue if Chester wanted to continue. He said she argued better than anyone he'd ever known, Chester said. Said she'd make a lawyer, afraid for his career. He said it like it was the best thing in the world. A pause. He said he was worried she'd spend her life on that farm and not have a stage wide enough for what she was capable of. Elizabeth was very still on the seat beside Cole. He never told me that, she said. It came out quiet, not quite broken, but close. He seemed like the kind of man who found it easier to tell other people how proud he was, Chester said. Elizabeth said nothing. Cole watched her hand tighten once on the bag, and then release. Processing it the way a person processes something they can't afford to sit with right now, filing it somewhere interior for later when there was room. He also said, Chester added, that if anything ever happened to him, his daughter would finish what he started. He said it like he was certain. Elizabeth looked at the horizon. Then we should make sure he was right. They were 3 hours out of the camp, pushing through the roughest stretch of Pelham's alternate route, when the trouble found them anyway. It didn't come from behind. That was the first miscalculation. Cole had been watching behind them, and Pelham had been reading the country ahead, and they'd both been calibrated to threats coming from the direction of Garnet Creek. The 2 riders came from the east, appearing out of a shallow wash that neither of them had flagged as a significant risk because it didn't connect to any road Nathan's men should have been covering. Cole saw them the same moment Pelham did. Pelham's hand went up. Cole eased the horses to a stop. The 2 riders weren't Greer's men. That was the first thing. They weren't wearing the particular set of their shoulders that men on Nathan's payroll wore, that deliberate, borrowed authority that came from having a powerful man's name behind them. These 2 were moving cautiously, carefully, in the posture of people who were trying not to be seen, rather than people who expected to be obeyed. One of them was a boy, 16, maybe 17. The other was a woman in her 40s with dust on her face and the particular expression of someone who had been riding a long time and was past the point of pretending they weren't exhausted. Pelham rode back to the wagon. You know them? Cole said quietly. Pelham looked at the woman more carefully. Something shifted in his face. That's Agnes Morales, he said. Cole felt Elizabeth go still beside him. Ernesto's wife, Elizabeth said. It wasn't a question. Widow, Pelham said. She left the county after Ernesto died. Or, I thought she left. Agnes Morales pulled her horse up 10 yards from the wagon and looked at Cole with the specific assessment of a woman who had learned the hard way that not everyone who appeared friendly was trustworthy. Her eyes moved from Cole to Elizabeth, and then to the bag on Elizabeth's lap, and then back to Elizabeth's face. "You're Thomas Harper's daughter," she said. It was the second time in 2 days that someone had said that to Elizabeth, and Cole noticed that each time it happened, it landed differently, less like an identification and more like a recognition. "Yes," Elizabeth said. "I heard you were running," Agnes said. "I heard Nathan's men were after you. I've been in the county for 3 weeks." She stopped. "I came back because I heard Thomas was dead. I came back because I knew what Thomas was building, and I came back because I needed to know if it was still alive." "It's alive," Elizabeth said. Agnes looked at the bag for a moment. "My husband's case is in there," she said. Not a question. "Everything my father had," Elizabeth said. "Yes." Agnes was quiet. The boy beside her son, Cole guessed. From the resemblance around, the eyes watched Agnes with the particular attention of a young person, trying to read what the adult they trusted most was feeling. "I have testimony," Agnes said. "I have things I saw, things I heard, that I never gave anyone because there was no one to give it to that I trusted. I've been carrying it for 8 years. Then you're coming with us," Elizabeth said. Agnes looked at her for a long moment. "To Cheyenne." "To Cheyenne," Elizabeth said. "To federal investigators who have no relationship with Nathan Caldwell. To people who will listen to what you have to say about your husband." The boy said, "Mama." Just that. But the way he said it held the whole weight of 8 years in it. 8 years of watching his mother carry something heavy. 8 years of growing up in the shadow of a loss that had never been properly accounted for. Agnes looked at her son, then at Elizabeth, then at the wide country around them. "We've been hiding long enough," she said. They moved with 7 people now. The group had more than doubled since the night before, and Cole was recalculating everything: the pace, the water needs, the visibility risk of a larger party. More people meant more tracks, more noise, more chances of being spotted. It also meant more witnesses, more testimony, more voices attached to the evidence in Elizabeth's bag. He kept those 2 things in tension and drove. Pelham called a halt at midday to rest the horses and eat from the provisions the Birches had brought from their camp. It was a short stop, water for the horses and cold food eaten standing up, because none of them wanted to be in one place longer than necessary. The conversation over that meal was the kind that happens when a group of people have all made the same difficult decision and are beginning to understand the others who made it with them. Dora Birch sat beside Agnes Morales and spoke quietly. Agnes listened, and then spoke, and Cole caught fragments: the same names, the same patterns, the particular shared recognition of people who had been victimized by the same method and were only now discovering each other's existence. Chester stood near Cole, eating without much apparent appetite. "You know what the hardest part was?" Chester said. "All those years. Not the fear, the silence. Knowing what I knew and having nowhere to put it. It becomes," he stopped, "it becomes its own kind of weight." "You're putting it down now," Cole said. "We all are," Chester said. He looked at the group around the small impromptu camp. "That's what I keep thinking. Every one of us has been carrying something alone for years. And it took Thomas Harper dying and his daughter running to put us all in the same place at the same time." He was quiet for a moment. "Does that seem right to you? That it required all that?" Cole thought about the Brennan family 12 years ago, and the choice he hadn't made. "No," he said. "It doesn't seem right. But here we are." Chester nodded slowly. "Here we are." They were an hour back on the move when Pelham, still riding point, pulled his horse sharply to a stop. Cole saw it and began slowing the team before Pelham had even turned around. Long years of reading other people's body language in the saddle. Something was wrong. Pelham rode back at a contained trot, controlled enough not to kick up visible dust. "Sixes, riders," he said. "Due north." Holding position on the ridge above the Garfield cut. Cole said, "Are they watching or waiting?" "Can't tell yet." "They're not moving, but they're positioned above the only passage through that section." Frank Birch said, That cut is the only reasonable way through in this country, short of going back and taking the main road. I know, Pelham said. Cole worked through the geography in his head. The main road was where Nathan had his heaviest presence. Going back meant adding not a day, but potentially 2, and burning time they couldn't afford. But 6 men positioned above a narrow cut were 6 men who held the high ground, and getting a wagon through a bottleneck with 6 armed men above it was not a situation that ended well. How long do we have before they see us? Cole said. They may already have, Pelham said carefully. If they're looking for a wagon and a group, we may already be what they're looking at. Elizabeth said, then we don't try to hide. We try to change what they see. Everyone looked at her. She was looking at the country ahead with that focused precision Cole had come to recognize not recklessness, but the particular speed of thought that happened when she'd moved past fear into problem solving. They're looking for 1 man and 1 woman in a wagon, she said. Fugitives. A woman Nathan's people have described as a criminal, a man they've described as a lawbreaker who's protecting her. What they're not looking for, what Greer's description won't have prepared them for, is a group. Ranchers, families, people who look like they have a legitimate reason to be on the move. We don't look like a group of innocents, Frank said. We look like people trying to avoid the main road. We look like exactly what we are, Dora said flatly. And that's the problem. Cole said, What are you thinking? He directed it at Elizabeth. She said, I'm thinking that Nathan's men are looking for me in particular. If I'm not visible, if I'm in the wagon bed with Chester under the canvas, and the wagon is driven by Frank with Dora beside him, then what those riders see is a ranch family moving with friends. Not a fugitive convoy. And you? Cole asked. You'd be hidden under canvas for however long it takes to clear the cut. I've been frightened for 2 weeks, Elizabeth said. I can manage uncomfortable. Roy Pelham looked at Cole. Cole thought through it. The risk was real. If the riders came down and searched, hiding Elizabeth would only confirm their suspicions. But Pelham was right that they were probably already visible, which meant the calculation wasn't between being seen and not being seen. It was between being seen as something dangerous and being seen as something unremarkable. How good an actor are you, Frank? Cole said. Frank Birch looked mildly offended. I've been to enough county commissioners where I had to be polite to Nathan Caldwell. I can manage 6 men I've never met all right, Cole said. He looked at Elizabeth. You're sure? I'm not sure of anything, Elizabeth said. But I'm decided. There was a difference, and they both knew it. They reorganized in the time they had. Elizabeth passed the bag to Cole, both of them registering the weight of that transfer, the particular trust it represented, and climbed into the wagon bed. Chester Avery pulled the canvas over them both, the evidence between them, and arranged himself around some supply crates in a way that might suggest, from a distance, nothing more than freight. Frank Birch took the wagon seat. Dora settled beside him, with a composure that Cole thought was genuinely remarkable, given that she was about to bluff 6 armed men while sitting on a hard bench. Cole rode one of the spare horses, pulling back to the rear of the group, positioning himself as a ranch hand, rather than a principal. Agnes Morales and her son fell in naturally. Roy Pelham stayed at point. They moved toward the cut. Cole kept his hands loose on the reins and his eyes on the ridgeline, watching the 6 figures up there do what mounted men do when they're deciding whether something they're looking at is their problem or not. The figures were still, watching. Cole kept the same pace, the same angle, the studied normalcy of people with somewhere to be and no particular anxiety about getting there. One of the riders left the ridge and started down. Cole breathed slowly. He counted. He didn't look directly at the approaching rider, because direct attention telegraphed awareness, and awareness telegraphed guilt. The rider came down to road level and crossed to intercept them. Not Greer, a younger man, sharper looking, with the particular alertness of someone who'd been told what to look for and was taking the assignment seriously. He pulled up beside Frank Birch's side of the wagon. "Morning," the rider said. "Morning," Frank said with the unhurried friendliness of a man who had spent decades being polite to people he didn't like. "You folks heading through the cut?" "Planning to," Frank said. Got a delivery to make at the Harker place. Running behind already. The rider looked at the wagon, at Dora, at the canvas over the back, at Cole at the rear, at Agnes and her son. His eyes were quick and professional. You come through Garnet Creek, he said. Came from the east, Frank said. Been camping the last 2 nights. My wife's cousin is at the Harker place, and we promised to get there before the week was out. He gestured at Dora, who gave the rider a look that managed to be simultaneously pleasant and faintly impatient in the way of a woman who had a destination and didn't appreciate delays. The rider looked at the wagon bed again. Cole watched from the rear, absolutely still. What's under the canvas? The rider said. Frank said, furniture mostly. Some of my wife's. She doesn't trust it to weather, even on a short haul. He paused. You're welcome to look if you need to. Though if you move the dresser wrong, she'll have something to say about it. He said it pleasantly, without any strain, with the weary resignation of a married man who'd had this conversation before. The rider looked at Dora. Dora looked at the rider with the expression of a woman who absolutely had opinions about how her furniture was handled. The rider made a decision. That's all right, he said. You folks have a good ride. He pulled his horse around and started back up toward the ridge. Nobody in the group spoke. They moved through the cut. On the other side, Cole rode forward to the wagon and quietly knocked twice on the side. A moment later, the canvas shifted and Elizabeth's hand appeared, and then her head, dust in her hair, expression controlled and alert. Cole passed the bag back to her. Their hands touched briefly in the transfer. Neither of them said anything about it. The afternoon wore on and the country changed as they put more distance between themselves and Garnet Creek County. The terrain was still rough, still demanding, but it had a different quality now, less like Nathan Caldwell's personal territory and more like land that belonged to itself. They camped that night in a shallow basin where the ground held some warmth. 7 people around a small, careful fire that Pelham kept deliberately low. The horses on a picket line, fed from the last of the grain in the wagon. Conversation that was quieter and more personal than the purposeful talk of the day, people who'd been through something together beginning to understand each other. The conversations mixed. Agnes Morales spoke about Ernesto. She didn't speak long, and she didn't use many words, but the words she used were specific and unsparing, and had the particular dignity of someone who had decided, after 8 years, to let the truth out of the private place she'd been keeping it. Her son sat beside her and listened with the focused attention of a young person, hearing for the full version of a story they'd only known in fragments. When she finished, Dora Birch put her hand over Agnes's hand and didn't say anything. Chester looked at the fire. Frank stared at the middle distance with his jaw set. Cole watched Elizabeth. She was listening to Agnes the way she listened to everything, with total attention, taking in everything, filing it in the same place where all of it was being filed. The system of wrongs that her father had started cataloging and that she was now completing. When Agnes finished, Elizabeth said quietly, "Will you tell all of that to the investigators in Cheyenne? Exactly as you told it just now?" Agnes said, "I'll tell them more. I've had 8 years to remember." Pelham was on first watch. Cole took second. The night was quiet in the way of open country at the edge of trouble, not peaceful exactly, but holding its breath. Around 2 in the morning, with the camps asleep behind him and the stars doing their slow rotation overhead, Elizabeth came and sat near him. Not beside him, a few feet away, in the particular middle distance of 2 people who are still working out the terms of being in close proximity. "You should sleep," he said. "I will," she said. "I wanted to ask you something first." "All right." She was quiet for a moment, gathering the question. "When this is over, when we get to Cheyenne, when the investigators have everything, when whatever is going to happen starts happening, what do you do?" Cole thought about that. "Go back, I suppose. The ranch is still there." "And that's enough for you?" He looked at her. "It has been." "Has been," she said. "That's past tense." He didn't respond immediately. "I'm not sure what you're asking," he said finally, which was true in the careful sense of someone who had an idea what was being asked, but wanted to be certain before walking into it. I'm asking if a man who's spent 12 years rebuilding his life in the absence of anyone else is still satisfied with that arrangement, Elizabeth said. Now that the arrangement has been somewhat disrupted. Cole was quiet. My father's land, he said carefully, is going to come back to you. If the evidence is what you say it is and the federal investigators are what they're supposed to be, Nathan Caldwell's fraudulent bill of sale gets thrown out, and your father's property rights are restored. I know that, she said. That land is 60 miles from my ranch, he said. I know that too, she said. They sat in the particular quiet of a conversation that had reached the edge of what two people who have known each other for 2 days can say out loud without it becoming something neither of them is quite ready for. Cole was aware of the distance between them, aware of the bag sitting at her feet, and everything it represented about who she was and where she came from, and what she'd survived. Aware of the fire behind them throwing just enough light to see the angle of her face. Ask me that question again, he said in Cheyenne. When we've done what we came to do. She looked at him. You're not saying no, she said. I'm saying not yet, he said. There's a difference. Elizabeth looked at him for a moment longer. Then she looked at the stars. My father used to say patience was a form of courage, she said. Smart man, Cole said, already established. She almost smiled. I'm going to sleep, she said. Good. She stood, picked up the bag, and walked back toward the wagon. At the edge of the firelight, she stopped without turning around. Cole, she said. Yes, he was right about you, she said. My father. He put your name in his notes. One of the people in the county he thought might, if it came to it, choose right. She paused. He was right. Cole didn't know what to say to that. He didn't say anything. She went back to the wagon. He sat with the rifle across his knees and the stars above him and the knowledge that Thomas Harper had written his name down and thought about what it meant to be the kind of man a careful, precise, thorough man like that had believed in. He decided it meant finishing this, whatever it cost. The third day broke cold, with a sharp wind from the north that had the horses restless and the camp moving fast. Pelham had them on the trail before the light was fully established, pushing pace in a way that Cole respected. The old man understood that the ground they'd covered had bought them time, but not safety, and that the time was finite. They were 5 miles into the morning when Chester, riding uneasily in the wagon bed, said, Something's wrong. Cole turned. Chester was looking behind them, not ahead, with the alert expression of a man who'd spent 6 years as a county clerk and had developed a finely tuned sense for when official machinery was in motion. What do you see? Dust, Chester said. A lot of it. Behind us and slightly north. Cole pulled the wagon up and stood on the seat to look. Chester was right. Dust rising from behind, from a distance that suggested a large, moving fast, not the dust of 2 or 3 men, but the kind of dust that a significant number of horses made when they were pushed. Pelham came back from point at a hard trot. We've got a problem, Pelham said, his voice tight in a way Cole hadn't heard from him before. How many? Cole said. Maybe 15. Coming from the northwest. Pelham's jaw was set. Nathan's not sending deputies anymore. Those are hired guns. I recognized 2 of them from 3 years ago, men who came in from outside the county when Nathan had a situation that he wanted handled without local witnesses. 12 to 15 men, against 7 people, 2 of whom were not fighters, 1 of whom was a woman, 1 of whom was a boy, and 1 of whom was a former county clerk who was holding the wagon rail with white knuckles. Cole looked at Elizabeth. She was already looking at him. Her face was clear and calm in the particular way of someone who has made all their calculations and arrived at a point where calm was the only remaining choice. They're not going to let us reach Cheyenne, she said. Not with all of us. Not with everything we have. No, Cole said. Then we have to change the calculation, she said. How, Frank Birch said, his voice steady but tight. Elizabeth said, they're after me, and they're after what I'm carrying. If both of those things are with me, they have one target. She looked at Cole. But if what I'm carrying goes ahead separately, Cole understood immediately. You want to split the evidence from the group. I want the evidence to reach Cheyenne even if I don't, Elizabeth said, with a directness that silenced everyone for a full beat. Dora Birch said, "Don't say it like that." "I'm not being dramatic," Elizabeth said. "I'm being practical. Chester, can you ride hard?" Chester Avery blinked. Can you hold a horse and not fall off?" "Yes," Chester said, with the determination of a man deciding to be more capable than he currently feels. "Then you take the bag," Elizabeth said. "You and Agnes and her son. You ride for Cheyenne, direct, on the fastest horses we have. You don't stop. You reach the federal land office and you present everything in that bag and your own testimony, and you explain where it came from and who built it, and you don't let anyone send you back." Agnes Morales was already nodding. "My son can ride," she said. "He can ride better than I can. Then he leads," Elizabeth said. "Chester, Agnes, you follow him." She looked at Pelham. "What's the fastest way to Cheyenne from here?" "Direct." "Not careful. Fast." Pelham gave her the route in 20 words. She made Chester repeat it back. Cole said, "And the rest of us?" Elizabeth said, "We slow them down." Silence. Frank Birch said, "You're talking about drawing 15 hired guns toward 3 people." "4, Dora said. Frank turned to his wife. Dora looked at him with an expression that closed the conversation. "4, she said again. Cole reached across and took the bag from Elizabeth. He held it out to Chester. Chester Avery took it with both hands. He looked at it, the way people look at things that they understand are larger than themselves. "You know what's in there," Elizabeth said to him. "You know what my father built. You know what it cost him." "I know," Chester said. "Then make sure it gets there." Chester met her eyes. "On my life," he said. It wasn't theatrical. It was the plain statement of a man who'd been afraid for 6 years, and was at this particular moment no longer afraid. They had the horses redistributed in 3 minutes, the fastest 2 animals from Pelham's string, going with Chester's group, Agnes's son in front, Chester and Agnes behind. The boy looked at his mother once, briefly, and she nodded. They rode hard and fast and didn't look back. The remaining 4, Cole, Elizabeth, Frank, Dora, watched them go. Then Cole turned the wagon to put it between their position and the approaching dust, and looked at the 3 people beside him with the quiet assessment of a man doing a final calculation. 12 to 15 men, 4 of them. Against those odds, fighting was not the answer. He'd known that from the moment Elizabeth had said, "Slow them down." The goal wasn't to defeat 15 hired guns. The goal was to buy Chester and Agnes enough time to clear the distance. "We're not fighting them," Cole said. "We're making them stop and think. Every minute they spend dealing with us is a minute they're not chasing the evidence." "And how do we make 15 men stop and think?" Frank asked. Cole reached under the wagon seat and pulled out a leather satchel. Inside it were the copies, the duplicates, that Elizabeth had made of the most critical documents before they'd left her father's farm, the ones she hadn't told him about until the second night. The insurance she'd built in with the same careful precision her father had used to build everything else. He held them up. "We let them see what we have," Cole said. "And we let them understand that what they're chasing is already gone." Elizabeth looked at the copies, then at Cole. "You knew about those," she said. "You told me your father was thorough," Cole said. "And you're your father's daughter." She looked at him for a moment with something in her eyes that was more complicated than gratitude and less simple than admiration. Something that 2 people build when they've been through several days of hard country together and found each other trustworthy at every turn. The dust was close now, close enough to hear, just barely, the sound underneath it. Cole stood down from the wagon, rifle in hand, and placed himself at the front of the group. 4 people. 4 people standing on open ground, with copies of documents that had already been sent ahead, waiting for 15 hired guns to come and find out that they'd arrived too late. Cole thought about Roy Pelham's words the first morning. About men who hadn't lost anything yet, having enough freedom to make the right choice. He thought about Thomas Harper, writing his name in careful notes. He thought about a family named Brennan 12 years ago, disappearing into distance while he stood at his fence line. He was done standing at fence lines. The riders came over the rise in a group, hard and fast, and Cole Whitaker stood in the open and didn't move. The lead rider pulled up hard 20 yards out, and the men behind him fanned wide in the instinct pattern of people who'd done this before, spreading to prevent a clean break, covering angles, making themselves a wall. Cole didn't move. He stood with the rifle at his side, not raised, not holstered. Present, the way a statement is present, not a threat, not a surrender. Just a man who had decided where he was standing and intended to remain there. The lead rider was not someone Cole recognized. That was the first notable thing. Not Greer, not any of the county deputies he'd cataloged in his memory over years of watching Nathan Caldwell's operation from a careful distance. This was someone, a man in his 40s, with the particular weathered quality of someone who'd ridden a lot of hard miles for a lot of different employers and had stopped asking questions about the nature of the work somewhere around the 10th year of doing it. Cole Whitaker, the man said. That's right, Cole said. My name is Voss. I've been hired to retrieve property belonging to Nathan Caldwell and to return Miss Elizabeth Harper to Garnet Creek for processing on outstanding charges. What property? Cole said. Voss looked at him steadily. Documents, letters, records taken from the Harper farm without authorization. Cole said, those documents belong to Thomas Harper's estate, which means they belong to his daughter, which means you've been hired to steal a dead man's property from his living child. Voss didn't blink. I've been hired to follow the law. Whose law? Cole said. Behind Cole, he felt rather than heard Elizabeth step forward to stand beside him. He didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on Voss. Voss looked at Elizabeth. Miss Harper, I'd prefer to resolve this without. Without what? Elizabeth said. Her voice was clear and completely steady. Without witnesses, without a record, without the inconvenience of explaining to a federal court why Nathan Caldwell sent 15 armed men after one woman and a bag of her father's papers. Voss said, the documents in question are claimed under fraudulent. The documents in question, Elizabeth said, are already in Cheyenne. Silence. Voss absorbed that. Cole watched it land, the particular quality of stillness that moves across a man's face when a piece of information arrives that forces an immediate and uncomfortable recalculation. I don't believe you, Voss said. But he said it like a man trying to determine whether he believed himself. You don't have to believe me, Elizabeth said. You have to decide whether it's worth finding out I'm telling the truth after your employer has already lost. Voss looked at the wagon, at the 4 people assembled behind Cole and Elizabeth, at the absence of the larger group that his intelligence presumably had told him to expect. Cole saw the moment Voss noticed the missing horses, the slight narrowing around the eyes, the quick count of people and animals that didn't match what he'd been told to look for. Where are the others? Voss said. On their way, Cole said simply. Voss turned his horse slightly and spoke in a low voice to the man closest to him on the right. That man pulled away from the group and rode back the way they'd come, fast. Voss had just sent someone to check, which meant Voss was now operating on the assumption that what Elizabeth had said might be true, and that meant he was operating on uncertainty, which was exactly where Cole needed him. You're stalling, Voss said. I'm standing on open ground with 3 other people against 15 of yours, Cole said. If I were stalling, I'd be doing a bad job of hiding it. I'm not stalling. I'm giving you the opportunity to make a decision before someone you work for explains to you that you've been part of a federal crime. Voss looked at him hard. That's a serious word. It's an accurate one, Cole said. Theft of property through forged documents, false legal proceedings, intimidation of witnesses, possible homicide. He paused. Thomas Harper, Ernesto Morales. Nathan Caldwell's system has been running for 12 years in this county, and every man who's helped run it is in that record. I'm not in any record, Voss said tightly. I arrived 4 days ago. Then you've got 4 days in it, Cole said, which means you've still got time to ride away from this before it gets thicker. That landed differently than Cole expected. He'd said it as a tactical measure, a way to introduce doubt, to slow Voss down, to complicate his calculation. But Voss looked at him with an expression that went somewhere deeper than calculation. The expression of a man who had spent a long time convincing himself that the work he did was simply work, and was now standing in a moment where that conviction was becoming harder to maintain. Frank Birch spoke from behind Cole, quietly but clearly. "I've lived in this county 30 years. I've watched Nathan Caldwell take apart everything decent people built here, piece by piece, and I've watched men like you help him do it because the money was good and the risk seemed small. I'm telling you now, the risk just changed." Dora said nothing. She didn't need to. She stood beside her husband with the absolute composed certainty of a woman who had made her decision and was not revisiting it, and that composure said more than any words would have. Voss looked at his men. Cole watched the quick invisible communication that passed through a group of hired men when a situation they were brought in to control is beginning to feel less controlled. The small adjustments of posture, the flickers of eye contact, the recalculation happening in 15 different heads simultaneously. Not all of them would break. Cole didn't expect them to. But he only needed some of them to be uncertain. Uncertain men didn't move fast. Uncertain men waited to see what happened next. The rider Voss had sent back came hard over the rise and pulled up, and the words he spoke to Voss were too low for Cole to hear, but the change in Voss's face was not. Chester had gotten through. Cole knew it from the way Voss's expression shifted, not to anger, exactly, but to the particular stillness of a man who has just been told that the thing he was supposed to prevent has already happened, and that the entire basis of his assignment has now changed shape. Elizabeth felt it too. Cole heard the breath she took beside him. "Call your men off," Cole said quietly to Voss. "Whatever Nathan Caldwell is paying you, it doesn't cover what happens next. You're not recovering those documents. You're not returning Miss Harper to a county jurisdiction that's already under federal scrutiny. The only question left is whether you and your men are on the right side of the line when the investigators arrive." Voss looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Elizabeth. "Your father," he said. "He built all this? He spent 2 years of his life building it," Elizabeth said. "And he died before he could use it. So I'm using it." Something shifted in Voss's face. It wasn't conscience. Exactly. Cole didn't think men in Voss's line of work had conscience as their primary operating mode. It was the calculation of a professional who had just reached the end of a calculation and arrived at a result he didn't like. He turned his horse. Without a word to his men, without any announcement, without any dramatic statement, Voss simply turned his horse and began riding back the way he'd come. And after a beat that lasted just long enough for the remaining 14 men to process what they were seeing, they followed him. One by one, then in groups, then all of them, the hired guns of Nathan Caldwell turned away from 4 people standing on open ground and rode north. Cole didn't move until the last of them was over the rise. Then he let out a breath. Behind him, Frank Birch said, very quietly, "Well, I'll be damned." Dora said, "Language, Frank." Frank said, "Yes, dear," and his voice was shaking slightly, in the way of someone whose composure has held for a long time, and is now allowed to be slightly less than perfect. Cole turned. Elizabeth was still facing the door. Voss had gone. She was standing very still, with her arms crossed and her head slightly bowed, and Cole understood from the particular quality of that stillness that she was doing what she had refused to do at any point in the last 4 days. She was letting herself feel it. He didn't speak. He gave her the time. After a long moment, she raised her head and looked at him. "He got through," she said. "He got through," Cole confirmed. She closed her eyes for 3 seconds. When she opened them, they were bright in a way that had nothing to do with weakness. "Then we need to move," she said. "We need to be in Cheyenne before Nathan can reach anyone in that office who might owe him a favor." Cole said, "How many people in the federal land office do you think Nathan Caldwell has in his pocket?" "I don't know," Elizabeth said. "But I know he has 20 years of practice buying people, and I know that federal investigators aren't the same as county officials. And I know that what Chester is carrying is enough that even a compromised investigator would have to take it seriously or risk being part of the case himself." She paused. "My father thought this through. All of it. I'm trusting his thinking." Cole looked at her for a moment. "Then let's go," he said. They made Cheyenne the next day, pushing harder than Cole would have chosen to push the horses under different circumstances. But the horses were good animals with more in them than they'd been asked for, yet, and they gave it without complaint. The federal land office was on a wide, noisy street that felt, after days of open country, overwhelming in the way of places that have too many people and too many sounds happening at the same time. Cole had been to Cheyenne twice before and had found it useful and uncomfortable in equal measure useful because it had things you couldn't get in small towns. Uncomfortable because it moved at a pace that made him feel slightly out of alignment with himself. Elizabeth didn't seem uncomfortable. She walked directly from the wagon to the land office door with the purposeful stride of someone who had been heading here for 4 days and had been mentally arriving for the whole of that time. Chester Avery was already inside. He was sitting across a wide desk from a man, Cole would later learn, was Deputy Federal Inspector Samuel Garrett, 45. Methodical, with the particular expression of someone who has just spent several hours reading documents and has stopped finding them, routine. Around him on the desk were the contents of Elizabeth's bag, arranged with the careful attention of someone who wanted to be sure they understood what they were looking at before they said anything about it. Chester stood when Elizabeth came through the door. He looked tired and dusty and slightly in shock, in the manner of a man who had ridden farther and faster than he'd believed himself capable of, and was only now understanding that he'd survived it. Miss Harper, Jed, rising from his chair. Inspector, Elizabeth said. Yours associate has been very thorough, Garrett said. He looked at the documents on the desk, then back at her. I need to ask you this marking system your father used. The notation in the margins of authenticated documents. Can you explain it to me in detail? Elizabeth sat down across from him and explained it. She explained it the same way she'd explained it to Cole on the first night, precisely, clearly, without embellishment. She showed him the legitimate documents from her father's files with the marks intact. She showed him the forged bill of sale that Nathan had produced, without the mark. She showed him 3 other forged documents from Nathan's transactions with other families, also without the mark. She laid them side by side. Garrett looked at them for a long time. Miss Harper, he said finally, your father was a very meticulous man. He was, Elizabeth said. He was also preparing for this specific conversation, Garrett said. This documentation is structured as if he anticipated every challenge an investigator would raise. The marks, the dated correspondence, the witness statements, it anticipates objections. He was a careful man, Elizabeth said. He knew the challenges he'd face. Garrett looked at her steadily. How long had he been building this? 2 years, Elizabeth said. From the moment he understood what Nathan Caldwell was doing. Garrett was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Where is your father now, Miss Harper? Elizabeth held the inspector's gaze without flinching. He died 2 weeks ago, she said. The county doctor attributed it to his heart. I believe it was attributed to fear and to a system that was closing around him. Garrett said nothing for a moment. Then he picked up a pen and wrote something on the notepad in front of him. I'm going to need to speak with everyone who is prepared to offer testimony, he said. And I'm going to need your group to remain available for the duration of the investigation. We're not going anywhere, Elizabeth said. Over the next 3 days, Cheyenne became the unlikely center of something that had been building for 12 years in Garnet Creek County. Garrett's team worked methodically, with the particular thoroughness of people who understood that a case built on pattern, evidence, needed to be airtight at every point, because the man they were building it against had 20 years of practice finding the places, not where cases weren't airtight and inserting his fingers. Chester testified for 6 hours on the first day. He sat in Garrett's office and described, from professional memory, every county record he had personally processed that was later altered, the specific entries, the specific changes, the dates, the names. He described the pressure he'd been under when he was removed from his position. He described the conversations. One of Nathan's attorneys had made it very clear that the terms of his departure depended on his agreement to remain quiet. He had remained quiet for 6 years. He did not remain quiet now. Agnes Morales testified for 4 hours. She described the last weeks of Ernesto's life, the meeting with Nathan's man, the refusal. The days after the refusal when she'd noticed strangers near their property, and Ernesto had begun riding different routes and checking the barn at night before he'd sleep. She described finding out he was gone. She described the 4-day investigation that had closed without resolution. She described signing the property transfer documents that she'd been told, in the absence of formal legal counsel, that she was required to sign within 60 days of her husband's death or face legal action. Her son sat in the waiting room outside Garrett's office for the entire 4 hours. When Agnes came out, he stood up and she held him for a long moment in the practical, complete way of a mother who has finally put down something very heavy. Roy Pelham testified for 3 hours and brought 30 years of direct knowledge about the land, the water rights, the grazing arrangements, and the specific ways in which Nathan's acquisitions had systematically targeted properties with river access. Frank and Dora Birch testified together and separately, providing the particular perspective of people who'd watched their county change over 30 years and could speak to the before, the during, and the ongoing reality of what Nathan Caldwell's consolidation had done to the community around them. Elizabeth testified last. She sat across from Garrett for 5 hours. She didn't stumble once. Cole sat in the waiting room for most of those 5 hours, in the chair that Agnes's son had occupied 2 days before, watching the door and thinking about Thomas Harper writing notes about a man named Cole Whitaker and deciding he was someone who might, when it came to it, choose right. He thought about what it cost to believe that about someone, to put someone's name in your records and hope that when everything else fell apart, that name would hold. He hoped he'd held. The door opened at the end of the 5th hour, and Elizabeth came out. She looked tired in a different way than she'd been tired before, not the exhaustion of someone being pursued, but the exhaustion of someone who has completed something enormous and is feeling the full weight of it now that the momentum was no longer required. She looked at Cole. He's opening a full investigation, she said. Federal. They'll subpoena the county records, the judge's financial records, the land company's incorporation documents. She paused. Garrett said it was the most comprehensively documented systematic fraud case he'd seen brought to this office. Cole said, your father's work. My father's work, she agreed. Then, and everyone who was willing to carry it. She sat down in the chair beside Cole, the one she hadn't chosen, crossed the waiting room, in the careful middle distance. She sat beside him. They were both quiet. What happens to Nathan now? Cole said. Garrett will move carefully, Elizabeth said. He said that men like Nathan expect frontal attacks and have defenses prepared for them. He said the most effective approach is to let the evidence speak from multiple angles simultaneously: the forged documents, the county records irregularities, Chester's testimony, Agnes's testimony, so that Nathan can't focus his counter-strategy on any single point. Smart, Cole said. He said it might take months, Elizabeth said. Before formal charges, before Nathan is actually unable to operate. Cole looked at her. How do you feel about that? She thought about it honestly. I feel like my father waited 2 years, she said. And I feel like I can wait a few months, as long as it gets done. She looked at her hands. I keep thinking about the Brennan family, she said. Cole went still. My father had notes about them. A family that lost land 12 years ago. He couldn't find them to include in his case. They'd moved on, and there was no record of where. She looked up. Did you know them? Cole held her gaze. He said. Elizabeth looked at him. You watched it happen, she said. It wasn't an accusation. Yes, he said. She was quiet for a moment. Is that why you stopped? She said. On the road. When I grabbed your arm. Yes, Cole said. That's why. Elizabeth looked at him with the expression of someone completing a picture they've been assembling piece by piece since the beginning. My father wrote something in his notes about you, she said. After your name, after the line about thinking you'd choose right. He wrote. She paused, as if deciding whether to say it. A man who has watched the wrong thing happen once is twice as dangerous to the people who do wrong. Cole was very still. He was talking about you, Elizabeth said. He was counting on exactly this. Cole looked at the door of Garrett's office. He looked at the waiting room. He thought about 12 years ago, and 2 weeks ago, and the 4 days in between here and there. He was a hell of a man, Cole said. Your father. He was, Elizabeth said. He would have liked you. I'd have liked him, Cole said. She smiled. It was the real one, not the brief controlled flash of the second morning, but the full version. The one that went all the way to her eyes and changed her whole face and made her look like someone with a future in front of her rather than just a past behind her. Cole, she said. Yes. Cheyenne, she said. We're in Cheyenne. He looked at her. Understood. We are, he said. You told me to ask you a question again when we got here, she said. When we'd done what we came to do. I did say that, he said. So I'm asking, she said. Cole looked at her for a long moment. At the woman who had grabbed a stranger's arm on a dark road and whispered words that had ended 12 years of him telling himself that other people's trouble wasn't his to carry. At the woman who had climbed into his wagon and held her father's evidence against her side for 4 days and stood on open ground against 15 armed men without backing up a step. At the woman whose father had written his name in careful notes and believed from a distance that he would choose right. My ranch is 60 miles from your father's land, he said. I know, she said. That's not very far, he said. No, she said, it's not. He looked at her steadily. I'd like to ask your permission to ride out and see it, he said. Your father's land. When this is all settled and you're back on it. My father's land, she said, is my land now, he corrected. Yes, she said. You can come see it. And maybe the time after that, he said. And maybe the time after that, she agreed. They sat beside each other in the waiting room of the Federal Land Office in Cheyenne, in the particular warmth of two people who have found their way to the same shore from different directions, and are just beginning to understand what that means. While outside the door the machinery of justice was starting the slow, grinding, necessary work of making things right. Chester Avery walked past the waiting room door, caught sight of them, and quietly kept walking. Roy Pelham appeared a moment later, looked in, and turned away with the private smile of an old man who recognized something he'd seen before and was glad to see again. Frank Birch found his wife in the corridor and took her hand without saying anything. Dora looked at him and said, "About time." Frank didn't ask what she meant. He knew. 3 weeks later, the first federal subpoena was served on Nathan Caldwell at his property in Garnet Creek County. The county sheriff, the one who owed Nathan the land his deputy station sat on, refused to be the one to serve it. A federal marshal came from Cheyenne instead on a Tuesday morning and handed it to Nathan Caldwell on his own front porch in front of 3 of his ranch hands and a foreman who had been with him for 15 years. Nathan read the document. He read it twice. He said nothing. The foreman later told people that Nathan's face when he read it was not the face of a man who was surprised. It was the face of a man who had known, for some time, that something like this was coming, and had spent the interval between that knowledge and this moment telling himself that his defenses would hold, that his influence would hold, that the system he'd built over 20 years was stronger than whatever was coming against it, that the defenses hadn't held, that the system wasn't stronger. It was the face of a man who had bet on fear and found out what happened when the people you'd been betting against stopped being afraid. In Garnet Creek, the news moved the way news moved in small counties, faster than wire, slower than fire, and not always accurately. But the substance of it arrived intact. Nathan Caldwell was under federal investigation. The county records were being reviewed by outside authority. Judge Haller had been notified that his financial relationships were under scrutiny and had quietly requested a leave of absence from the bench. In the homes of the Hendersons, wherever they'd ended up. In whatever place the Morales family had spent 8 years rebuilding. In the corners of the county where people had been quiet for a very long time about the things they'd seen and the things they'd lost. The news arrived, and people said things they hadn't said out loud in years. Cole heard about it from Pelham, who'd ridden back to Garnet Creek to see what there was to see and ridden out again with a report that was more satisfying than anything he'd expected. The whole county's talking, Pelham said. People who haven't spoken publicly about Nathan in years are talking. Every time a subpoena gets served, Every time a federal marshal is seen in the county, every time Garrett's men show up at the courthouse to pull records, it's like a window opening. Cole said, "How's Nathan taking it?" "He's hired attorneys from 3 different cities," Pelham said. "He's fighting it. He'll fight everything he can for as long as he can. Men like him don't stop because something becomes difficult. They stop because they run out of road." "And the road?" Cole said. Pelham looked at him. "Getting shorter," he said. "Every day." Cole thought about Elizabeth, 60 miles away on her father's land, working through the inventory of what needed doing on a farm that had been unattended for several weeks. He'd ridden out twice since Cheyenne, and both times he'd stayed through the better part of a day, helping with what needed helping and talking with her in the particular easy way that people talk when they've been through something serious together and found the other person to be exactly who they seemed. She was building something, not just repairing the farm, building something from the ground up with the same patient thoroughness her father had brought to his documentation. She'd been in contact with Garrett's office regularly, available for every question, every additional piece of testimony, every clarification. She'd organized the other witnesses into a structure that Garrett's team could access efficiently. She was, as her father had apparently always known, she would be very good at this. Cole sat on Pelham's porch and looked at the country around them and thought about 60 miles. Not very far. Not very far at all. The trial began on a Thursday in October, 6 months after Chester Avery had ridden hard into Cheyenne, with a leather bag across his chest and fear in his throat, and the determination of a man who had finally decided that 6 years of silence was enough. Cole was there when the doors of the federal courthouse opened. He'd ridden in the night before, staying at the same boarding house he'd used on the 2 previous visits to Cheyenne, and he'd barely slept, not from anxiety exactly, but from the particular alertness of someone who understood that a thing they'd been moving toward for a long time was now arriving, and that arrival deserved full attention. Elizabeth was already at the courthouse when he got there. She was standing outside with Chester and Garrett's assistant, going over something in a folder with the focused economy of someone who had reviewed it many times and was reviewing it one more time because thoroughness was the only standard she knew how to apply. She was wearing a dark blue dress he hadn't seen before, and her hair was up in a way that was more formal than anything he'd seen on the trail. And she looked, he thought, like exactly the person Thomas Harper had always known she'd become, given a stage wide enough. She looked up when she saw him. "You came," she said. "Of course I came," Cole said. She held his gaze for a moment, and there was something in it that wasn't surprise she'd known he would come. And they both knew she'd known, but was something more like the solid satisfaction of a person whose trust's been confirmed so many times that it has stopped being trust and started being simply knowledge. "How are you?" he said. "Ready," she said. "I've been ready for 2 weeks." "I know," he said. She handed the folder back to Chester and walked to Cole. They stood together briefly, not touching, in the way they'd developed over the months, a particular proximate ease that acknowledged everything between them without needing to announce it. "Garrett says the case is strong," she said quietly. "He says Nathan's attorneys are going to challenge the authentication of the documents first. Attack the marking system, argue it was invented after the fact. But Garrett's brought in an independent document examiner from St. Louis who's confirmed the ink age and the consistency of the markings across authenticated documents going back 15 years. So the marks hold," Cole said. "The marks hold," she said. "And then they're going to argue that my father's witness statements were obtained under duress, or that the witnesses were coached." She paused. "Chester's already been deposed. Agnes, Roy, all of them. Garrett said their testimony is consistent to a degree that only happens when people are telling the truth about the same events." "Because they are," Cole said. "Because they are," she agreed. She looked at the courthouse door. "He's going to be in there," she said. "I know. I haven't seen him since before my father died. Since the last time Nathan's men came to our farm with a new offer and my father told them to leave." She was quiet for a moment. "My father walked them to the fence line himself. I watched from the porch. He walked back to the house afterward, and he said she stopped, started again. He said, Elizabeth, a man who keeps asking the same question after you've answered, it isn't really asking. He's practicing for something else. Cole said nothing. He let her have the moment. I understood what he meant then, she said. I understand it better now. They went inside. Nathan Caldwell was already seated at the defense table when the courtroom filled. Cole had seen Nathan twice before for the kind of distance you maintain when you've decided that proximity to certain kinds of power is its own form of risk. Up close, Nathan was both more and less than Cole had expected. More ordinary, a heavy-set man in his 60s, well-dressed, with the careful grooming of someone who understood that appearance was a form of argument. And less imposing, less commanding than 20 years of feared reputation suggested. He looked, Cole thought, like what he was, a man who had built an empire on the assumption that nobody would ever put all the pieces together, and who was now sitting in a federal courtroom watching someone do exactly that. Nathan looked across the courtroom. His eyes found Elizabeth. He held her gaze for a long moment. Cole watched both of them, Nathan with the cold assessment of someone calculating how much damage she could do, Elizabeth with the steady, direct attention of someone who had nothing to calculate, because everything she had was already on the table. Already in the record, already spoken in deposition by 7 different voices. Elizabeth didn't look away, Nathan did. Cole noted it and said nothing. The lead federal prosecutor was a woman named Harriet Doyle, compact, sharp, with the particular economy of movement and language that belonged to someone who had spent 20 years arguing cases and had long since eliminated everything unnecessary from her process. She'd reviewed the full case with Elizabeth 3 times over the preceding month, and Cole had been present for one of those sessions. And he'd come away from it with the quiet certainty that whatever Nathan's attorneys had prepared, they had not prepared for Harriet Doyle. She opened without ceremony. Your Honor, she said, the United States government will demonstrate that over a period of 12 years, Nathan Caldwell systematically used forged documents, corrupted local authority, and in at least one case, circumstances strongly suggestive of deliberate homicide, to seize property from 11 families in Garnet Creek County, Wyoming Territory. We will demonstrate this through documentary evidence, through the testimony of expert witnesses, and through the direct accounts of survivors whose silence was purchased through fear and whose voices are now, finally, being heard. The courtroom was quiet. In the silence, Cole heard the man beside him, Roy Pelham, who had come in from Garnet Creek and was sitting 2 seats down, let out a slow, controlled breath. The breath of someone who had been carrying something for a long time. The first day of testimony was Chester Avery's. He sat in the witness chair the way he'd sat in Garrett's office in Cheyenne 6 months ago, with the precise, careful attention of a man who understood that the details mattered and who was determined to get every detail exactly right. He described his 6 years as county clerk. He described the documents he'd processed. He described the specific irregularities he'd observed, the entries that appeared in the records. After the fact, the recording dates that had been changed, the deeds with alterations in the property descriptions. He described the conversation with Nathan's attorney that had preceded his removal from the clerk's office, and he described it with a specificity that told the courtroom he'd been remembering it, word for word, for 6 years. Nathan's lead attorney, a man named Forsyth, who had come down from Denver and had the well-fed competence of someone accustomed to winning, cross-examined Chester for 2 hours. He tried 6 different approaches. He challenged Chester's memory, his motivation, his professional competence, his relationship with Thomas Harper, and the timing of his decision to come forward. Chester answered every question with the same quiet, specific precision. After the 6th approach failed, Forsyth sat down. The document examiner from St. Louis testified on the 2nd day. He was a dry, methodical man who explained his field with the calm certainty of someone who had never been successfully argued out of a position by someone who didn't have the evidence to support the argument. He described the marking system Thomas Harper had developed. He described the physical evidence of the marks, the ink consistency, the pressure patterns, the way they appeared across 15 years of authenticated documents. He described the absence of the marks from the forged bill of sale and from 3 other fraudulent documents Nathan had produced. He said, plainly and without embellishment, these documents were not signed by Thomas Harper. The forged signatures are technically proficient, but the authentication system, Mr. Harper employed throughout his records a system no forger could have known to replicate is absent. The original documents and the forged ones were not produced by the same hand or in the same context. Nathan's attorney argued for 2 hours that the authentication system was invented after the fact. The document examiner explained, patiently, why that was physically impossible given the age of the ink. The attorney tried again from a different angle. The examiner explained it again. The judge, a federal appointee from outside the territory with no financial connections to anyone in Garnet Creek County, listened to all of it, with the expression of someone keeping careful score. Agnes Morales testified on the 3rd day. She sat in the witness chair, and she described 8 years in 35 minutes. And when she was done, the courtroom was quiet in a way that had nothing to do with legal procedure and everything to do with the particular silence that falls on the people who have just heard something true about the worst thing that can happen to a family. Forsyth looked at his notes. He started to stand. He looked at Agnes. He sat back down. He cross-examined her for 11 minutes on peripheral details and then said he had no further questions. On the 4th day, Nathan's attorneys made their first significant move. They introduced a counter-witness, a man named Briggs, who claimed to have witnessed Thomas Harper signing the bill of sale in question in the presence of Nathan Caldwell on a specific date 3 weeks before Thomas died. The courtroom shifted. Cole felt Elizabeth go still beside him in the gallery. He didn't look at her. He watched Briggs, on the stand, describe in practice detail a meeting that had, according to him, taken place in Nathan Caldwell's study. Harriet Doyle stood for cross-examination. She asked Briggs one question. Mr. Briggs, on the date you've described, were you employed by Nathan Caldwell's land company? Briggs said, I worked for various parties in a consulting. Were you employed by Nathan Caldwell's land company on that date? Yes or no? A pause. Yes. And how long have you been employed by Nathan Caldwell's land company? Another pause, slightly longer, approximately 9 years. 9 years, Doyle said. Thank you, no further questions. It was enough. Not devastating on its own, a paid employee could still be a truthful witness, and Forsyth made exactly that argument on redirect. But it was a crack, and cracks had a way of becoming relevant later. What became relevant later was Roy Pelham. Pelham took the stand on the 5th day, and he was not Chester's careful precision or Agnes's quiet devastation. He was 40 years of direct knowledge delivered in the flat, unhurried voice of a man who had seen everything he was describing with his own eyes and had no patience for suggestion that he might be mistaken. He described the specific date, 8 years prior, when Briggs Nathan's counter-witness had compelled to property, along with 2 other men, to deliver an offer from Nathan Caldwell's land company. He described Briggs's face in specific terms. He described the conversation. He described saying no. Then Harriet Doyle asked, on the date Mr. Nathan Caldwell has stated his meeting with Thomas Harper took place the date on which Mr. Briggs claims to have witnessed the signing of this document. Where was Mr. Briggs? To your knowledge, Pelham said. He was on my property. He arrived in the morning and he left in the late afternoon. I had a dispute with him about the fence line between my north pasture and land Nathan was claiming. It lasted most of the day. The courtroom understood before Forsyth was on his feet. If Briggs was on Pelham's property all day, he could not have witnessed a signing in Nathan's study, 60 miles away. Forsyth argued the date. He argued Pelham's memory. He argued the relevance. The judge listened to all of it and then asked Pelham to confirm the date one more time. Pelham confirmed it. He confirmed it the way he confirmed everything, without drama, without hesitation, without any of the qualities that suggested rehearsal. He confirmed it the way a man confirms something he saw with his own eyes on a day that mattered. Briggs was recalled. Under re-examination, under the specific pressure of Pelham's testimony and Doyle's follow-up questions, Briggs's account began to develop inconsistencies. Small ones at first, details about the room, about who else was present, about the time of day. And then larger ones, when Doyle pressed on specifics that a genuine witness would know, and Briggs demonstrably did not. By the end of Briggs's second session in the witness chair, Forsyth had stopped taking notes. Elizabeth testified on the sixth day. Cole watched her walk to the witness chair. And he thought about the road outside Garnet Creek, and the dust rising behind her, and the fingers wrapped around his arm, and the voice that had been stripped of everything except the essential truth of what it needed to say. She testified for 7 hours across 2 sessions. She described her father's system. She described the 2 years he'd spent building the case. The last week of his life, his health, his mood, the conversation in which he'd given her the location of everything he'd gathered. She described finding him. She described the county doctor who'd been called by Nathan Caldwell. She described the 3 days between her death and the appearance of Nathan's bills of sale. She described running. She described Cole. Not extensively, she wasn't there to tell a story about him. She was there to establish the chain of custody of the evidence and the circumstances of her flight from the county. But she described the moment on the road clearly and without sentimentality. A man she didn't know had made a choice that had made everything else possible. Forsyth cross-examined her for 4 hours. He tried the same approaches he'd tried with Chester: motivation, timing, the suggestion that she'd invented the authentication system retroactively, the suggestion that her grief had distorted her recollection of her father's final week. Elizabeth answered every question with the same level, specific precision she'd been applying to everything since the first morning in Cole's wagon. At the end of the 4th hour, Forsyth said something that Cole would remember precisely for the rest of his life. He said, "Miss Harper, isn't it possible that your father was simply a man who made a business arrangement he later regretted? And that this entire proceeding is the product of a grieving daughter who cannot accept that her father was not the man she believed him to be?" The courtroom went very still. Elizabeth looked at Forsyth. She said, "My father was a man who spent 2 years of his life building a record that would protect people he'd never met from a man who had been hurting them for a decade. He did it carefully, and he did it quietly, and he died before he could see it used. The proceeding you're questioning is the direct result of his thoroughness and his faith that the truth, properly documented and properly presented, would be stronger than money and fear and 20 years of practiced fraud." She paused. "I think that answers your question." Forsyth had no further questions. Cole sat in the gallery and thought about Thomas Harper. He thought about a man he'd never met, who had written his name in a notebook and believed without evidence, purely on the basis of observed character, that he would choose right when it counted. He thought about 12 years of building that reputation without knowing it was being built. He thought about a fence line in front of a farm owned by people named Brennan, and a choice he'd made at that fence line that had felt like self-preservation, and had been, he understood now, in the full and unsparing way of someone who had lived long enough to see the consequences of their decisions, cowardice dressed in the clothes of caution. He thought about Elizabeth's hand on his arm on a dark road, and how something that had been holding for 12 years had let go in that moment. Nathan Caldwell did not take the stand. His attorneys argued that the prosecution's case rested on contested documentary evidence and the testimony of witnesses with demonstrated grievances against their client. They argued that grievance was not evidence. They argued that Thomas Harper's marking system was an elaborate construct built after the fact to support a predetermined conclusion. They argued that Chester Avery was a disgruntled former employee. They argued that Agnes Morales's account, while sympathetic, was the account of a widow who had been unable to accept the accidental nature of her husband's death. They argued well. Forsyth was not a man who lost cases because he lacked ability. He lost this one because the evidence was better than the argument. The jury deliberated for 2 days. Cole and Elizabeth sat in the boarding house common room on the first evening of deliberation and didn't talk much. There wasn't much to say that they hadn't already said, and the particular anxiety of waiting for something that was out of your hands was not a thing that talking made better. Dora Birch brought coffee, without being asked, and then went back to her conversation with Agnes, without asking if they wanted company. She understood them well enough by now to know they didn't. Chester sat near the window with a book he'd been trying to read for a week and hadn't made progress on. Roy Pelham played cards with Frank Birch and occasionally made a comment that wasn't funny, but that Frank laughed at anyway, because after everything they'd been through together, Frank had decided that Roy Pelham's company was worth appreciating. Elizabeth said, at some point in the evening, "What do you do when you stop being afraid of the outcome?" Cole looked at her. "What do you mean?" he said. "I mean that I've been afraid since the night I ran," she said. "Afraid on the road, afraid in the draw, afraid when Voss's men came over the rise, afraid in Garrett's office, afraid every day for 6 months waiting for this trial. And now I'm sitting here and the fear is gone. I don't know what happened to it." She paused. "I don't know what comes next without it." Cole thought about that honestly. "I think what comes next," he said, "is just your life. The one that fear's been standing in front of." She looked at him. "My father's land." "Your land," he said. "The farm needs a lot of work," she said. "It's been empty for months. The fences on the east side are down. The north pasture needs reseeding. The barn roof has a section that didn't survive the summer." She said it practically, the way she said everything, not as complaint, but as inventory. "I know some things about fence lines," Cole said. "I know you do," she said. "And I've been told I'm not bad with a barn roof," he said. She looked at him with the particular action she'd had on the second morning, the one that measured and found accurate. "Cole," she said, "yes. 60 miles isn't very far," she said. "No," he said, "it isn't. And you've been riding it regularly for 6 months," she said. "I have," he said. "How many more times do you think you can do that before it starts to seem inefficient?" she said. Cole looked at her for a long moment. Then, he said, "I've been thinking about that." "Have you?" she said. "I have," he said. "I've been thinking that a man with a working ranch 60 miles from a woman with a farm that needs repair could either keep making that ride, which the horses are going to start complaining about, or he could—" He stopped. Thought about how to say the next part correctly. "Your father's land has good water access." "It does," she said. "And the pasture, once it's reseeded, could support a reasonable cattle operation," he said. "It could," she said. "I've been running a one-man outfit for 12 years," he said. "Gets inefficient after a while." Elizabeth looked at him steadily. "Cole Whitaker," she said. "Are you trying to propose a business arrangement?" "No," he said. She waited. "I'm trying to propose a permanent arrangement," he said. "That also involves a business component. Because you are a practical woman and I am a practical man, and I think if I went about this any other way you'd find it suspicious." Elizabeth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "My father's notes about you." "What about them?" "The last line," she said. "After the part about you being twice as dangerous to people who do wrong. He wrote one more thing." She looked at him directly. He wrote, "If he ever meets Elizabeth, I hope he's smart enough to know what he's found." Cole was very still. "He wrote that," Cole said. "He wrote that," she said. "He never met me," Cole said. "No," Elizabeth said. "He just watched and wrote down what he saw." She paused. "He was very good at that." Cole looked at her, at the woman who had grabbed a stranger's arm and changed 12 years of a life he'd been living at a careful and private distance from anything that required him to be accountable to someone else. At the woman who had stood on open ground against 15 armed men without backing up. At the woman who had sat in a federal witness chair for 7 hours and never stumbled and never flinched and never once stopped being exactly who she was. He thought she might be the most remarkable person he'd ever been in the same room with. He thought Thomas Harper had known that. "Yes," Cole said. Elizabeth looked at him. "Yes to the permanent arrangement," she said. "Yes," he said. She held his gaze for a moment. And then she reached across the table and put her hand over his, and it was the first time she'd touched him since Cheyenne, since the brief transfer of the bag on open ground, with 15 horses coming over a rise. And it was the quietest, most complete thing that had happened in all the months between that moment and this one. "My father would have been insufferably pleased with himself," she said. "Sounds right," Cole said. The jury came back the next morning. Guilty on 14 counts: fraudulent land acquisition, forgery of legal documents, corruption of public officials, witness intimidation, conspiracy, and on the count that had the most personal weight, unlawful killing in furtherance of criminal enterprise, applied to the death of Ernesto Morales. On the basis of evidence that had been assembled by a meticulous man over 2 years and carried by his daughter across 4 days of hostile country and 6 months of federal proceedings. Guilty. Nathan Caldwell, when the verdict was read, looked at his hands. He sat very still. His attorneys leaned toward him and spoke, and he didn't appear to hear them. He looked at the defendant's table as if he were counting the grain in the wood. Cole watched him. He didn't feel what he'd expected to feel: not satisfaction, exactly, and not triumph. Something quieter, the particular feeling of a thing that has been wrong for a long time finally being made right, which is not the same as joy, because it can't be, not when you understand what the wrongness cost. He thought about the Hendersons, wherever they'd ended up. The Morales family, Agnes, and her son, who had sat in a waiting room for 4 hours, while his mother finally said out loud the true story of his father's death. The widow Sutton, who had come west with her brother's claim and left 3 months later. The Brennan family 12 years ago, who had disappeared into the distance while Cole Whitaker stood at a fence line and told himself it wasn't his fight. He thought about all of them. And then he thought about a Thursday evening on a road outside Garnet Creek, with dust rising behind a woman who had nowhere left to run, and a wagon seat with room enough for 2 people, and a choice. The only choice, when he looked back at it, that had ever made sense. Agnes Morales cried quietly in the row behind Cole. Her son put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and the 2 of them sat that way through the reading of the sentence, which was substantial and federal and came with the weight of authority that had nothing to do with Garnet Creek County's compromised systems. Chester Avery sat with his hands folded and his head slightly bowed, and Cole thought he looked like a man who had put down a weight he'd been carrying for so long that the absence of it was its own kind of dizziness. Roy Pelham said nothing. He sat straight in his chair with the expression of a man who had seen this county taken apart and had just seen the first piece of it put back. Frank and Dora Birch held hands. Elizabeth sat beside Cole and looked at the front of the courtroom, and he could see her face clearly, and he could see that she was thinking about her father. He didn't have to ask. It was visible in the same way that grief is always visible in the faces of people who have loved someone deeply, not in breaking down, but in the particular quality of holding still. In the moment when something finally resolves that the person you loved most cannot see. Cole covered her hand with his. She turned to look at him. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. They walked out of the courthouse into October light, the whole group of them, Cole and Elizabeth, Chester, Agnes and her son, Roy Pelham, Frank and Dora, and they stood together on the wide, noisy street of Cheyenne, the way people stand when they've finished something enormous and the world is just starting to resume its normal shape around them. Roy Pelham said, "Your father would have known exactly what to say right now." Elizabeth said, "He would have said that the work isn't finished. That restoring what was taken takes longer than taking it did, and that the community has to rebuild itself the same way he built his case piece by piece, with patience, in the direction of the truth." She paused, and then he would have said, "Now let's go home." Pelham looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded, once slowly, the nod of a man who has heard something accurate and recognized it. They went home. Cole and Elizabeth rode the 60 miles back to her father's land, her land together. And when they came over the last rise, and the farm came into view below them, with the east fence down, and the north pasture waiting, and the barn roof showing its bad section against the afternoon sky, Elizabeth pulled her horse up. She looked at it. Cole pulled up beside her. He looked at her. "It needs a lot of work," she said. "It does," he said. "We should start with the fence," she said. "The east side. If the fence is down, the pasture's no good." "Makes sense," he said. She sat for a moment, looking at the farm that was hers now, fully legally, documented and restored, and beyond the reach of anyone who had tried to take it. The land her father had built for 20 years and spent 2 years fighting for, and died before he could stand on with the freedom of someone who had won. She sat on it for him. She sat on it for herself. She sat on it for the future that her father had believed in with such complete and patient certainty that he'd written a stranger's name in his notebook and trusted that the stranger would find his way to this moment. "Coles," he said. "Thank you," she said, "for stopping." He looked at her, at everything she was, at the 12 years of distance he'd kept from the world, and the arm she'd grabbed on a dark road, and everything that had happened between that moment and this one. "Thank you," he said, "for grabbing my arm." She smiled. The real one, the full one, the one that went all the way to her eyes and had a future in it. And Cole Whitaker, who had spent 12 years believing that other people's trouble was not his to carry, who had stood at a fence line once and chosen wrong and carried that choice like a stone in his chest for every year since, who had driven a wagon through hostile country with a rifle across his knees and stood on open ground against hired guns and sat in a federal courtroom for 6 days, watching us be assembled the same slow and careful way that truth always has to be assembled. Cole Whitaker rode down toward that farm with the woman beside him, who was going to spend her life making sure it was never taken again. He never did call himself a legend, but in every county from Garnet Creek to Cheyenne, people told the story of the cowboy who had stopped his wagon on a dark road when a frightened woman grabbed his arm, and who had not asked what it would cost him, but what would happen if nobody helped her. And in the telling, every time, that was the moment that mattered. Not the confrontation with Voss on open ground, not the 6 days in a federal courtroom, not the 14 guilty counts read out by a federal judge in October. The moment that made the legend was quieter than all of that. It was a man alone on a road who heard someone say they were coming for her and chose to stand between her and the darkness instead of driving past it. That was the story. That was always the story. And it was true.